Can you take 6, please? Park up. Right, welcome to New Horizons, everybody, and a massively happy New Year to you all. And a huge welcome back to Neil Sanders with MK Ultra, LSD and the Hippie Movement. Neil's interest and expertise in the research and exposure of mass social conditioning, highlighting the brilliant minds and cold hearts of certain types of, usually men. Social conditioning has been around for centuries, varying from overt and aggressive to gradually more subtle. The Inquisition, for example, or the coercion of men and underage boys to fight during World War I, for instance. The boys being presented with a white feather by girls, themselves altered in some way. The men exposed to persistent newspaper headlines and propagandist posters. My grandfather was an infantry soldier at 15 after no doubt feeling the call of duty. Neil tonight focuses on the marked increase in certain drug availability and sudden appearance of a group of young people worlds apart from their parents during the mid-60s and onwards, the hippies, who may have evolved naturally or, on the other hand, been the result of a well-planned experiment. So, without further ado, let's find out a little bit more. Neil Sanders, thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Excellent, that's the spirit. Right, okay, so hopefully some of you know who I am. I tend to talk about mind control. Mind control falls broadly into 4 categories. Trying to coerce information, truth serums, getting information from interrogation scenarios, wiping people's memories so that they cannot reveal facts and such in interrogations. The total control of emotions and physicality, which can be done through hypnosis, it can be done through trauma, it can be done through the use of certain machines, radio waves and electromagnetic functions. And then the final type falls into the category of propaganda and sort of social control, perception management, directing the social trends and such like that. So today what I'm going to talk about is LSD, principally, and how LSD links in with the 60s movement. Hopefully all of you have got sort of like a cursory knowledge of what I mean by, say, flower power generation, the anti-war movement, the hippies, and the 60s music scene. My contention is that, sadly, the whole thing, the elements that started the 60s, that sort of fermented the 60s, and then the elements that ultimately destroyed the 60s were all intelligence agency experiments. This is my contention, and hopefully I'm going to show that with this talk. So, one of the main ways of sort of creating mind control is through trauma. I don't know if anyone's ever been in like a car accident or anything like that, or knows anybody who's been in a car accident. Often you won't be able to remember the actual crash itself. You'll sort of wake up at the side of the road, or you'll have to be told later what happened. So, oh no, yeah, you span across the road and you ended up flipping the car 3 or 4 times. That's not because you've blanked out, it's not because you've become unconscious or anything like that. What it is that your brain has a defense mechanism whereby very, very traumatic memories, it will blank them out, it will create an amnesic shell around them, therefore basically stopping you from reliving that traumatic experience again and again and again and again. And this is why basically when repressed memories come back, that's why it happens, because these amnesic barriers are breaking down. If you can do that enough, what you can do is you can split the mind into several sort of barriers like this, like a sort of honeycomb or a grid pattern. And each of the individual sort of, sections could be considered like an individual personality, and they could even be unaware of the other personalities. So that is one method. But what we're going to talk about today is the druggings, essentially. Now, although the application of trauma is effective, it was very, very effectively used by the CIA and also by Nazi Germany as well. What they wanted to do was they wanted to gain a far more measured control of the response to stimuli, and so the CIA were far more interested in the use of drugs and also the use of hypnotic suggestion. But drugs such as LSD were seen as a potential weapon due to their hallucinatory and perception-altering effects. Now, in 1951, in the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit. It is alleged that the CIA released a cloud of high-grade aerosolized LSD into the area, which basically caused mass hallucinations. Several people went mad, and a couple of people actually ended up dying. One person drowned under the effects of the drug. Now, actually, if you go into the official records, the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident is still explained as being the result of the fabulously psychedelic qualities of some mouldy local bread. But to be quite honest, if we're being brutally honest, the fact that the allegation that the CIA basically attacked a nation state with an experimental drug has always floated ominously on the horizon. An undated CIA document entitled D-lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25, stated, "Some of the more outstanding effects are the mental confusion, helplessness, and extreme anxiety which are produced by minute doses of this substance. Based upon these reactions, its potential use in offensive psychological warfare and in interrogation is considerable. It may become one of the most important psychochemical agents." So where did LSD come from? Well, the psychedelic drug LSD was first synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and he was working for a company called Sandoz, S-A-N-D-O-S, which is now called Novartis. And this is a pharmacological laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. And he first discovered LSD in 1938, but it wasn't until 5 years later, in April 1943, that he actually discovered that it had psychedelic properties. Now, the reason that he was looking into LSD was to obtain a respiratory and a circulatory stimulant, which is known as an analeptic. It basically used to be used in surgery. But whilst he was resynthesizing this in 1943, he accidentally absorbed a bit of it into his fingers. Some of you may know that LSD, you can absorb it through your skin. And so serendipitously, he managed to discover the fabulous psychedelic properties of it. And he described the events. He said, "I was affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, and intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away." And so this was with an absolutely microscopic dose of LSD that he managed to do this. So 3 days later, on 19th of April 1943, Hofmann decided to perform what would be termed an ill-advised experiment on himself in order to determine the true effects of LSD. See, Hofmann ingested 0.25 milligrams or 250 micrograms of pure, uncut LSD, an amount which he predicted was a threshold dose. Now, some of you probably know that a threshold dose of LSD is actually just under 20 micrograms, so what he'd actually taken there constituted more than 10 strong hits. Now, less than an hour after administering this, shall we say, Herculean dose, Hofmann experienced sudden and intense changes in his perceptions. Now, he didn't think that this was a very good idea to stay at work, so he decided to go home. Luckily, he was persuaded not to use his car because it was illegal in the time, because it was during wartime. So far more sensibly, he decided to make a trip home on his bicycle, which I think we can assume was probably at least difficult. Now, those who participate in recreational LSD have since named this fateful day, the 19th of April 1943, as Bicycle Day. And so if somebody says that they're enjoying Bicycle Day, basically what it means is that they're going down and take some LSD. And it is commemorated with stamps in Switzerland as well. So, on this psychedelic journey, basically his condition began to deteriorate incredibly rapidly. His mind raced with very powerful feelings of anxiety, and he actually began to believe that his next door neighbour, who he'd never really got on with, he thought that the explanation for this was that she's a witch and she's cursed him, and that he was going to die because of it. Later, when he sort of started to calm down, he realised that it was the LSD, but then just thought, oh, I've poisoned myself, this is no good, is it? And so eventually a doctor was called and basically tried to attend to the wildly tripping Hofmann. And he seemed fine. The only thing that actually seemed physically wrong with him were his eyes were the size of saucers. But apart from that, he was physically okay. So the doctor basically sat and chatted to him for, I think he basically took him about an hour of just calming, talking to him, soothing and chatting to him. And eventually his anxiety was replaced by what he described as an exquisite euphoria. And again, Hoffman described this. He said, "Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegating, opening, and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridising themselves in a constant flux." Now this is LSD that was produced by Sanders. This is obviously years later in 1951. But in 1947, and you've got to remember that this is when the CIA was first starting, this is when the CIA was taking its fledgling steps and moving from the SS to the OSS to the CIA. And so it was incredibly, incredibly interested in LSD because obviously it could be a game-changing drug. At the same time, the US Office of Naval Intelligence was beginning mescaline studies. Mescaline is basically kind of like LSD. It's not quite as potent. It's more soft because it comes from peyote, which is a mushroom, so it's not as very intense as LSD is. And they were using this for interrogation purposes under the sponsorship of Project Chatter. Now, the same year, 1947, LSD first appeared in Swiss pharmacological journals. But it wasn't until 2 years later in 1949 that a gentleman called Dr. Max Rinkel actually brought LSD back to the United States from Sanders and began experimenting with patients in hospitals in Boston. Soon after this, also in 1949, a gentleman called Nick Bursell started experimenting covertly on patients in hospitals in Los Angeles as well. In 1953, which some of you may know is when MK Ultra was starting, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was part and was financed by MK Ultra, began treating alcoholics with LSD. Whether he was actually treating them or whether this is a cover for examining the effects, we will probably never know, but I lean towards the latter if I was being honest. Now, the same year, in 1953, the CIA, who was clearly taken with this new science, attempted to buy 10 kilograms of LSD from Sanders laboratories. Now, bearing in mind that a single gram of LSD contains around 10,000 doses, so with such a large order, we can assume that the CIA was trying to corner the market in this particular substance. Unfortunately, Sanders informed the CIA that at that time, only 40 grams of LSD had ever been made in the entire world, and so unfortunately, 10 kilograms was a little bit out of their hands. And this is basically because making LSD is incredibly difficult. You need to get the precise conditions on ergot mold in order to cause the lysergic acid, and then you have to do several other things to do it to make it turn into LSD. So the likelihood that these French people went mad from eating mouldy bread it's just rubbish, isn't it? So what happened? So the CIA basically didn't want all this LSD, so they decided that the best thing to do was go to the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. Now Eli Lilly said, okay, fine, we can't produce the real thing, but what we can do is we can synthetically copy it and we can synthetically start to produce LSD for you. And in 1954, the CIA began Operation MK Pilot. Now, MK Pilot was taking place at Lexington Narcotics Hospital. This is essentially like the Priory or something like that, so people are there to get treated for drug addiction. And instead, specifically black heroin addicts were tested with LSD, not for any particular curative reason, just to see how much LSD one particular person could take. Now, the same year, who would later spearhead Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute's LSD experiments in the Haight-Ashbury area, had his book, The Doors of Perception, published. Now, the Doors rock group actually took their name from the title of that specific text. And we'll come back to Aldous Huxley later. Now, in mid-1954, the pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly finally synthesized LSD at the CIA's behest, and this basically gave the CIA a limitless and relatively inexpensive supply, and it removed the necessity for Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, to provide their stockpiles. A year later, in 1955, Aldous Huxley actually experienced his first LSD trip, and then shortly after he published his essay Heaven and Hell. Now, Heaven and Hell discusses the relationship between bright, colourful objects, geometric designs, psychoactive substances, art and profound experiences, and it's a promotional tool for the use of LSD. Heaven and hell refer metaphorically to what Huxley perceives as the two contrary mystical experiences that could potentially wade you through the doors of perception. Essentially, you're going to have a good time or you're going to have a bad time. Now, in 1961, the army actually initiated the use of LSD in interrogations on foreign agents, and this was called Operation Third Chance. Another operation that also used LSD in interrogation scenarios was called Operation Derby Hat. However, by 1962, officially the CIA withdrew support for above-ground LSD research studies. But this is absolute garbage because basically the Tulane University was carrying on with Robert Heath. Harvard was doing experimentation, McGill University in Canada, Colgate University was doing it, St Thomas's Hospital in London was doing it, Lexington, Kentucky, and about 40 others basically. So the idea that they stopped actually using LSD is something of a misnomer. And at the same time, Congress passed and began to enforce drug safety regulations. So what they did was they made the substance illegal. Now, in the same year, the FDA designated LSD as an experimental-only drug and strictly restricted research. And by April 1966, Sanders had officially stopped supplying LSD to research scientists. This is not because they care about you and because they don't want you to harm yourself on LSD. This is so that only the CIA can study it. That's it. That's as simple as that. There is always another reason behind any drug legislation. In this particular thing, it was so that nobody else could get to understand how this particular drug worked. And as I say, Ewan Cameron was still using LSD throughout the 60s in Canada, as was William Sargent in London. And LSD experiments were also performed in Birmingham Hospital in England under a gentleman called Joel Elks, who later went over to America and continued with MK Ultra. And the other thing is the children were also tested with LSD, and not just a few, quite a lot. Creedmoor State Hospital in 1963, I believe, released a report talking about 4 to 14-year-old boys that were given daily intravenous doses of LSD, just to basically see what happened. Now, in a memo describing the purpose of one particular MK-Ultra program, Richard Helms, who was the head of CIA at the time, stated, "We intend to investigate the development of a chemical material which causes a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state, the specific nature of which can be reasonably well predicted for each individual. This material could potentially aid in discrediting individuals, eliciting information, and implanting suggestions and other forms of mental control." Now, they were obviously doing lots of experiments with these various types of things in safe houses and hospitals and various places all over America. Now, one particular New York Times article actually explained the hopes of those involved in those experiments, and this was an expose of the history of the CIA. And so the experimentation was aimed at finalising techniques that could not only be used on the enemy, but also for reasons of national security on their own previously loyal agents. And this is the quote. It said, "They wanted to reduce a man to a bewildered, self-doubting mass, to subvert his principles. They wanted to direct him in ways that may vary from rationalising a disloyal act to the construction of a new personality. One of their longest-running goals was to develop a way to induce amnesia. They wanted to be able to interrogate enemy espionage agents in such a way that neither the agents nor their superiors would know that they had been compromised. And they wanted to be able to wipe clean the memories of their own agents after certain missions, and especially when they were going into retirement." I want you to remember that for the second half of the talk, wiping people's memories, replacing behaviour patterns with other people, because somebody that's rather surprising did exactly the same thing. But that was the point of all the MK-Ultra experiments in Canada, all the MK-Ultra experiments in London, all the MK-Ultra experiments in Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, wiping people's memories so that they could then... it was sold as a therapeutic practice, so they were wiping away harmful patterns so that they could introduce new socially viable patterns, basically. And it was all run by this gentleman, Sidney Gottlieb, who was the overall head of the MK-Ultra program. And In hundreds of experiments, he personally gave LSD to numerous people, including prison inmates, because essentially they can't argue. And one of these included the mob boss, Whitey Bulger, who actually complained of headaches, hallucinations and nightmares for the rest of his life. And basically, Whitey Bulger was an extremely violent Irish mob boss. So has anyone seen the film The Departed? You know the Jack Nicholson character in there? Jack Nicholson based his character on Whitey Bulger, so you know he's a fairly unsavoury character, basically. The question that I ask is, was this personality the result of MKUltra experiments? And the question that I further ask is, was this personality the desired result of these MKUltra experiments? I mean, what better way to impose fear on a society than to provide the occasional celebrity terroriser? And then obviously we all go running to the police for them to protect us. Now, Bulger actually complained that he and other inmates believed that they were helping in a medical study to find a cure for schizophrenia, and Bulger also stated that he was recruited by deception. So why do I think that this was done on purpose? Well, interestingly, Bulger served as an FBI informant since as early as 1975. Now, seemingly, Whitey Bulger was able to act with impunity in return for information given to the authorities concerning the Patriarca Mafia crime family. Now, on December 1994, Bulger actually fled his hometown of Boston and went into hiding after receiving a direct tip-off from the FBI that basically the police were after him for a pending RICO Act indictment, which would have meant certain imprisonment for Bulger. Thanks to the FBI, Whitey Bulger escaped imprisonment for a further 16 years. When he was eventually captured last year, he was indicted for a total of 19 murders. Now, Gottlieb basically gave massive doses of hallucinogenic material without consent to hundreds of unwitting guinea pigs, and these included fellow agents, doctors, prostitutes, mental patients, prisoners, and of course, the general public. And he actually admitted in 1977 that even President Nixon was not immune to the experimentation of the agency. When travelling abroad on at least one occasion, Nixon's entire entourage was secretly drugged with LSD. Now, ABC News later confirmed that one of these incidents took place in 1972 during Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union. Now, the CIA was clearly not actually that concerned with the ongoing Cold War and felt that this was an appropriate time to test their cavalcade of mind-altering chemicals. Now, the timing and the geography of this particular event suggests one of two things. Either the CIA are mind-meltingly arrogant and just do not care about the number of nuclear faux pas that they could cause in this situation, or alternatively, that the Cold War was a load of rubbish, and the whole point of the Cold War was to basically pin two people against and channel funds towards the military-industrial complex. Interestingly, the phrase Cold War was created by Walter Lippmann when he was working for the Tavistock Institute, because if we were going to sell this idea to people, it's got to have a name and a concept that people understand. Now, several people of varying merit also participated in MKUltra mind-controlled experiments, and these are all carried out by various faculties of the US government. Now, obviously, their actual influence of these experiments is debated. One of them was Ted Kaczynski, which is also known as the Unabomber. Now, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, participated in CIA-sponsored MKUltra experiments conducted at Harvard University from the fall of 1959 through to the spring of 1962. During World War II, Henry Murray, who was the lead researcher for Harvard experiments, served with the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA. Murray applied for the grant funded by the United States Office of Naval Intelligence at his Harvard stress experiments. And he says that they strongly resembled the interrogation techniques that the OSS, later the CIA, used. Beginning when he was 16, Kaczynski participated along with 21 other undergraduate students in the Harvard experiments, which were described by doctors as disturbing and ethically indefensible. Another of the experiments was author and promoter of hippie values and ideals, Ken Kesey. Merry prankster Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, volunteered for MKUltra experiments involving LSD and other psychedelic drugs at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park while he was a student at nearby Stanford University. Kesey's experiments, whilst under the influence of LSD, inspired him to promote the drug outside the context of MK Ultra experiments, which influenced the early development of the hippie culture. Now, obviously, all of these people in some way have affected the shaping of the modern world. And of course, military men were not immune to the testing of their masters. Certain installations providing fruitful crops of young subjects who, aside from anything else, are trained to obey orders. These are actually British troops, and they're going under LSD experimentation they're on acid. Unethical practice by physicians and the direct involvement of pharmaceutical companies are part of the history of hallucinogens. Under top secret clearance, Eli Lilly, the company, was given a $400,000 grant in 1953 to manufacture and supply LSD to the CIA. Army LSD research was ongoing in 1977 when LSD was a controlled substance. At least 1,500 soldiers were given LSD without informed consent as part of Army mind control experiments. Now, among experiments that were authorised by Gottlieb were those that we spoke briefly about. Harris Isabel, who ran the Centre for Addiction Research at Lexington, Kentucky. And he would conduct hundreds of racially specific experiments using only black heroin addicts as research fodder. In one such experiment, he kept 7 of these addicts completely addled with quadruple doses of LSD without interruption for 77 days straight. If they fell asleep, he'd give them a gentle prod, a cattle prod, to make sure that they didn't fall back to sleep. In another experiment, Isabel strapped 9 men down, face down onto stretchers, inserted rectal thermometers, intravenously doped them up with psilocybins, shined lights in their eyes to make sure that their pupils were working, and then smashed their legs and arms with hammers to make sure that the central nervous system was unaffected. Now, there are numerous other experiments like this. In all of these hard-working people were paid by the American government in large amounts of pure heroin. Now, in 1954, Isabel reported on the results of his experimentation to test the amount of LSD that one patient could stand, and he wrote, "Our experiment on the tolerance to LSD 25 have been proceeding well, although I continue to be somewhat surprised by the results, which to me are the most amazing demonstration of drug tolerance that I have ever seen. I have 7 patients who have now been taking the drug for 42 days. All are quite tolerant to both the psychological and mental effects of the drug. We have attempted to break this tolerance by administering double, triple and quadruple doses." So the most he got was one guy going for about 77 days on quadruple doses of LSD. What happened to the guy afterwards, I don't know. To be honest, I imagine he was a mess. Now, Isabel was by no means the only doctor using his position in order to test new methods of manipulation. In the mid-1950s, Paul Hock, a man who would become the Commissioner of Mental Hygiene for the state of New York, so a very prestigious man, gave a pseudo-neurotic schizophrenic patient mescaline. The patient had a not unfamiliar heaven and hell journey on the compound, but Hock followed this up with a transorbital lutectomy, which is essentially taking a piece of his brain out. Hock also gave a patient LSD and a local anaesthetic, and then proceeded to remove pieces of the cerebral cortex whilst the patient was awake, asking at various motions whether the patient's perceptions were changing. So what he was doing was he was trying to mimic what the LSD was doing on one side of the brain, on the other side of the brain, whilst the patient was still awake. Now, one notable death connected to the testing of substances in MK Ultra was this gentleman, Dr. Frank Olson. He was an Army biological warfare specialist who was thrown out of a window after being spiked with a huge dose of LSD. Now, the evidence actually suggests he was murdered, but technically it's still considered death by misadventure. But this was raised by Senator Ted Kennedy in 1977, prompting an investigation into MK Ultra, and this is basically where we get the majority of the documents, aside from there's a gentleman called John Marks who wrote a book called In Search of for the Manchurian Candidate. He did a Freedom of Information request, so they're the two sources that we basically get the documents from. But if I'm being brutally honest, these are just the tip of the iceberg. Olson was basically reportedly looking to aerosolise weapons deployment, and there is a possibility that he was the person that deployed the cloud of LSD in Pont Saint-Esprit. The other possibility is that he was actually spraying, in the Korean War, he was developing bombs that could spread aerosolised pockets of anthrax. It has also been suggested that Olson became ultimately dispirited with his role after witnessing the outcome of a failed experiment, a failed mind control experiment on foreign prisoners that involved barbiturates and amphetamines. Basically, the experiment failed to yield any useful results, so these foreign prisoners were taken out the back of the military facility, told to dig their own graves and then shot in the back of the head. And this basically ultimately left a bad taste in Olson's mouth. Now, and this has been reported many times, in the CIA's very first experiment with LSD on a group of unwitting men, one of them, Dr. Frank Olson, a civilian working on top-secret germ warfare in a unit at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which provided data for both the Army and the CIA, went into a depression that ended with his leap from a 10th-story hotel room window in Manhattan in 1953. Earlier in the same year, in the first experiment with psychochemicals, Harold Blauer, a professional tennis player, had been given a fatal dose of mescaline derivative at the New York State Psychiatric Institute in Manhattan. The fact that both men died in government experiments was kept secret from their families and the general public for more than 20 years. 2 years after the deaths, the CIA made an arrangement with the Bureau of Narcotics to test LSD surreptitiously on unwitting victims, patrons of bars in New York and San Francisco, some of whom became violently ill and were hospitalized, never knowing exactly what had happened to them. The other thing that they did was they actually went around New York and San Francisco and the subway system in New York and basically dropped large sort of like stink bombs, I suppose. One in San Francisco, they actually had a car that was pumping aerosolized LSD out of the tailpipe. And so, you know, they're not averse to testing on the general public. Now, in November 1953, Frank Olson, who was working on an MK Ultra project, was, without his knowledge, slipped a large dose of LSD in his Cointreau at a party attended by CIA personnel, and for weeks afterwards he remained in what witnesses described as a state of depression. He confided to one CIA doctor that he felt that the agency was plotting against him and putting something in his coffee to keep him awake at night. He also said that he was hearing voices that commanded him to throw his wallet away, which he did, even though it actually contained about 3 uncashed paychecks. On the last night of his life, he checked into a room at the Statler Hotel along with a CIA agent who was assigned to watch over him, and he allegedly jumped through a closed hotel window. And it was Sidney Gottlieb that actually slipped Frank Olson the LSD. Sidney Gottlieb also slipped it to Frank Blauer, the professional tennis player who died of an LSD. He died not of a mescaline overdose, he died of complications due to the LSD. Operation Midnight Climax, which at least shows a hint of a sense of humour when the CIA are naming their projects, set up a fake brothel and then drugged and filmed its unwitting customers. Those who discovered this and consented were given far higher doses, and one gentleman, basically, who's obviously a big fan of LSD, sat there for over 70 days. Now these sessions were viewed by this agent, George Hunter White, who sat on a portable toilet with a drink in hand, watching the hapless Johns through a two-way mirror. Now, White was apparently a notorious drinker, and he would go through about 1.5 bottles of gin a night, so, you know, that's why he was sat on a toilet. And he noted down everything that he saw. And he was actually involved in the search for truth serums before the official start of MK Ultra, and was experimenting with drugs at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington. He was using mescaline, scopolamine, and marijuana on unsuspecting test subjects. Now, White actually called LSD stormy due to the insane behaviour they caused. And he actually continued his operating his Telegraph Hill LSD brothel until he retired from the service. And when he died, his widow actually gave the Electronic Museum in San Francisco his diaries. And according to the Washington Post, these diaries provide documentary evidence that White met to discuss drugs and safe houses with such CIA luminaries as Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, head of the Chemical Division of the Technical Service Division, and the man who ran MK Ultra, and Dr. Robert Lashbrook, a CIA chemist who worked with LSD. Other high-ranking CIA officials mentioned prominently include James Angleton, Stanley Lovell, and C.P. Cable. Gottlieb and Lashbrook have been subpoenaed to testify before a Senate subcommittee investigating the MK Ultra project, but they didn't really say anything. Robert Lashbrook was involved in Canada, wiping people's memories with Ewan Cameron. Now, White actually detailed in his diary how one of his favourite hobbies was going down to the local restaurants, or going down to the local beach, or hanging out at sea bars and slipping people, unsuspecting members of the public, doses of LSD, and then just sitting back and laughing as these people went insane. And upon retirement, he actually wrote to Harry Anslinger, who was his boss at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he said, "I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" And the All-Highest means the agency. Now, Operation Midnight Climax consisted of a web of CIA-run safe houses in San Francisco, Marin and New York, which were established in order to study the effects of LSD on consenting individuals. Prostitutes on the CIA payroll were instructed to lure clients back to safe houses where they were surreptitiously plied with a wide range of substances, including LSD, and monitored behind two-way mirrors. Several significant operational techniques were developed in this theatre, including extensive research into sexual blackmail, surveillance technology, and the possible use of mind-altering drugs in field operations. Now, Richard Stratton actually interviewed George White's last living associate in 1994. Now, according to White's lieutenant, Ike Feldman, and you've got to appreciate this is his very best friend. White was a son of a bitch, but he was a great cop. He made that fruitcake Hoover look like Nancy Drew. The LSD, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Now write this down. Espionage, assassinations, dirty tricks, drug experimentations, sexual encounters, and the study of prostitutes for clandestine use. That's what I was doing when I worked for George White and the CIA. Now, George White was infamous for a particular skill that he perfected, namely assassination. Now, his particular method was a single, powerful, close fist to the back of the skull, just behind the ear, and then what this would do is would cause a small shield of bone to punch through and basically stab into your brain, killing you, hopefully killing you almost instantaneously. By strange coincidence, this is exactly the same injury that killed senior biochemist Frank Olson. And by either further strange coincidence, the CIA agent that was assigned to look after Frank Olson in his troubled state at the Statler Hotel in New York was none other than George White. I have my suspicions, I'll be honest. Okay, so now we're getting on to the sort of the meat. So that gives you the idea of the sort of background. So this gives you the idea of the lack of scruples that the CIA and the military-industrial complex have got, and also the sort of lengths that they will go to try this drug. You've also got to remember as well, okay, bear in mind that at this time LSD was illegal. Sandoz had stopped producing it. Only Eli Lilly was producing it. Okay, so. And this is initially strange, but it is a very true fact concerning artists in the top echelons of film and music, is how frequently their managers, all their producers have military and or military-industrial complex connections. Now, there's an excellent article online written by a brilliant researcher called David McGowan. He identified and elaborated on this in his excellent work, Inside the LC, the strange but mostly true story of Laurel Canyon and the birth of the hippie generation. It's a fantastic piece of work, I think. Everyone should get it. Also get his book, Program to Kill. Brilliant stuff. Now, also in these particular online articles, he evidences the involvement of many of the sort of golden stars of the 60s in organised crime, drug dealing, murder, prostitution, child pornography, snuff movies, and ultimately black magic. Now, he's got many examples of people that are connected to the military-industrial complex. I've taken a few, and I've also got a few that I found out myself. So here are a few examples of musicians from the hippie era, all who had family ties to members of the US military, and all who, by some amazing coincidence and good fortune, all moved simultaneously to the Laurel Canyon and later the Haight-Ashby area to start the hippie and the youth culture explosion. Now, apologies if people are fans of these guys. Jim Morrison of The Doors was son to George Stephen Morrison, who was a prominent US Navy admiral. Admiral Morrison, Jim Morrison's dad, was the commander-in-chief, the admiral on deck during the US Naval Forces in the notorious Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, during the infamous staged incident in August, he was in charge. He was Joint Chiefs of Staff, which means he was in charge of the entire mission. Just to explain to people who don't understand what the Gulf of Tonkin incident is, everybody knows what a false flag incident is, right? If I go into a building and blow it up and pretend to be a Muslim, that's a false flag because I've got a false flag up. I'm pretending to be somebody that I'm not. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which took the American population into the Vietnam War, it was not a false flag event, it was a completely manufactured event. What happened was they were trying to provoke the North Vietnamese to take a pot shot at them, therefore they could attack, that's it, we're at war. This never happened, so cleverly Jim Morrison's dad just made it up. Just made it up. 65,000 American soldiers dead, over 2 million North Vietnamese dead, God knows how many South Vietnamese dead. Why? Because of a lie, an absolute lie. It's because there's money to be made out of wars, there's new weapons to be tested, there's drugs. What was the main thing that came out of Vietnam? Drugs. Heroin. Heroin, which was also after the hippie explosion. You get people involved in one, actually I'm not saying certain drugs are a gateway, I think that's wrong. But what it does do is it puts you in a scenario whereby you don't so much mind breaking the law. Or you're in a scenario where you're surrounded by people who have got connections to other things. So it's not a gateway drug, but it opens doors for you. And therefore, basically, the government, who let's not muck about, supplies all of it, because nobody's got any boats, nobody's got any planes, they can then take everyone to heroin. The amount of soldiers that came back from the Vietnam War strung out on heroin was unbelievable. More soldiers kill themselves when they come home from conflicts than die in the actual conflicts. But we digress. So essentially, his father was Admiral Morrison. Now, Jim regularly visited and stayed on military bases during his childhood, and there are also rumours that he was sexually abused as a younger, and possibly rumours that his father was the culprit. Here's Jim, 2 years before the Doors' first album came out, looking quite different. Here's his dad on deck. Now, Jim always claimed to the media that his parents had died in a car crash when he was very young, when in actual fact, both his parents outlived him. Now, as an interesting aside, because we're talking about mind control, Jim claimed that he was possessed by the spirit of a Native American shaman. And this Native American shaman gave Jim Morrison his vocal ability. When Morrison quit the music industry, he explained to the media and to the rest of his bandmates that he could no longer perform or sing because the Native American shaman had departed from his body, leaving him talentless. Frank Zappa's father, Frank Zappa, worked as a mathematician and a chemist for the US defence industry at the notorious Edgware Arsenal. Edgware Arsenal is basically one of these, like Fort Detrick, Maryland. It's one of the places where all the mind control experiment drugs are produced, including one called STP, which we'll come to later. Now, despite being commonly thought of as a key figure within the hippie movement, Frank Zappa actually never made it a secret that he had nothing but contempt for the hippie ethos. He also had a complete contempt for anybody that took any type of illegal drugs. And despite popular belief, he actually describes himself as a conservative and a Republican. Frank Zappa never made it a secret. He actually was also a vocal supporter of the Vietnam War, which not a lot of people realise. Zappa also married Gail Sloatman, Adelaide Gail Sloatman, who was raised in a Korean military family which produced a long line of Korean naval officers. Now, his father-in-law, her father, reportedly worked on classified nuclear weapons research for the US Navy. Now, his wife, Gail Sloatman, attended by sheer coincidence the exact same kindergarten as none other than Jim Morrison, where she's rumoured on one occasion to actually have hit him across the head with a hammer. Now, Gail herself also worked as a secretary for the Office of Naval Research, and she once told an interviewer that she heard voices all of her life. American folk singer Joan Baez, his father, Albert Baez, was described as a bright young Stanford Research Institute scientist who later took on a post at Los Alamos, Mexico, home of the atomic bomb. He was also a research physicist at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, at a time when the institute was definitely being used for MK Ultra mind control experiments. Joan Baez, gone too far. Joan Baez claimed to be a victim of ritual abuse as a child and also claimed to have multiple personalities. When Joan's father was head of operations research at Cornell, part of his role consisted of working closely, controlling the funds of the Human Ecology Fund. Some of you may know that the Human Ecology Fund is a financial fund that basically equals the CIA MK Ultra project. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Poppers, Papa John Phillips, was the son of a retired Marine Corps captain named Claude Andrew Phillips. Remember him because we'll come back to him later. John was accordingly educated at a series of elite military prep schools in Washington, D.C. and attended the prestigious U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. Phillips was married at one time to Susie Adams, who was a direct descendant of founding father John Adams, who was America's first vice president and second president after George Washington. The former Miss Adams claimed her father was a veteran of cloak and dagger stuff with the Air Force in Vienna. Now, she also worked at the Pentagon, so his first wife, or second wife, I forget, worked at the Pentagon, as did his sister. John Phillips' sister, Rosie, also worked with the Pentagon for over 30 years. John's mother, Dean, also worked at the Pentagon for over 30 years, but in what capacity, it is unknown. John Phillips, Cass Elliott, Jim Morrison and Adelaide Gale Sloatman all went to exactly the same kindergarten and exactly the same high school, then moved to the Laurel Canyon area within a week of one another. Coincidence? Now, actress Mackenzie Phillips, who's John Phillips' daughter, claimed in her autobiography that she and her father had had a 10-year incestuous relationship beginning in 1979 when she was aged 19. Now, apparently the abuse began on her wedding night when Phillips allegedly raped her while they were both under the influence of heroin. Whilst Mackenzie has never recanted her allegations, even going so far as to claim that her father paid for the abortion of a baby that was his, the rest of the family actually claim that this is untrue. An interesting aside here, Cass Elliott and John Phillips knew the Manson family. They didn't just know them, they were good friends with them. They knew them incredibly well. Mama Cass actually lived just across the street from Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski, who were two of the members of the Tate slaying. Family members Bobby Bosley and Tex Watson also for a time lived on the same street. Now, the Manson family actually used to stay with Cass Elliott for extended periods of time. This was when they weren't hanging out with Dennis Wilson or Jimi Hendrix or Neil Young, which they were all good friends with. One of the interesting connections is that Elliott and Phillips were both listed as defence witnesses during the Charles Manson trial, but were never actually called because Charles Manson did not put on a defence. Cass Elliott's boyfriend was a drug dealer called Billy Doyle. Some of you may know a little bit about the Manson killings. I could talk for hours about them, so if you want to come and chat to me afterwards, feel free. Her boyfriend was a gentleman called Billy Doyle. Billy Doyle was a drug dealer that had sold Wojtek Frykowski a bad batch of MDA. MDA is basically ecstasy. The night before the Tate slayings, Billy Doyle, Mama Cass's boyfriend, straight Satan motorcyclist, was whipped, tied up and sodomised at the Polanski house by Wojtek Frykowski. So we can see that the actual reasons for the killings and the connections with these people go an awful lot deeper than what you've been told. David Crosby of the Byrds and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young was the son of a military intelligence officer, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. In 1927, Floyd Crosby, the father of David Crosby, was in Haiti during the occupation by the US Marines, and also present was Captain Claude Andrew Phillips, the father of Papa John Phillips. Coincidence? Suffice it to say that the Crosby family tree includes a dizzying array of US senators and congressmen, state senators and assemblymen, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence and members of the Continental Congress. Joni Mitchell's father, Bill Anderson, was an officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and during the war years she actually moved with her parents to a number of bases in Western Canada. Jackson Brown was born in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, and the product of yet another career military family. Brown's father was assigned to post-war reconstruction work in Germany, which is likely a euphemism for being in the employ of the CIA, or the OSS as it was called. Graham Parsons of the Flying Burrito Brothers was the son of Major Cecil Ingram Coondog Connor II, who was a decorated military officer and bomber pilot who reportedly flew over 50 successful combat missions. Stephen Stills of Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills and Nash also came from a military family. Stephen Stills attended schools on military bases and was later sent to the elite military institution, Admiral Farragut Academy, to continue his education. Jerry Garcia, legendary guitarist of the anti-establishment great In an interview in Rolling Stone magazine that he joined the army in 1960. He was discharged within a year for being constantly AWOL, although rather strangely he received no further punishment for this rather serious transgression. Another mystery is how Jerry Garcia actually managed to join the army at that time, because he was only 17 at the time. Jimi Hendrix was born on the 27th of November 1942 in Seattle, Washington, whilst his father was stationed at an army base in Oklahoma. Jimi Hendrix also later joined the parachute corps. He broke his ankle, supposedly on purpose, and actually left the army. But when he first moved to London as a virtuoso guitar player in London, he actually supported, this is again not commonly known, but he actually supported the Vietnam War. He felt that the threat of communism, particularly Chinese communism, was enough to enter into Vietnam. It was only later, having spent time with the Beatles and certain other activists in London, that he changed his mind, and he later became a vocal promoter of the Black Panther Party as well. And this may be what led to his downfall. You see, Jimi Hendrix's manager was this shadowy figure named Michael Jeffrey, who admitted to being an intelligence agency with links to both British and American intelligence services. Now, this was highlighted in several books: Jimi Hendrix, Electric Gypsy, Hellhounds on their Trails, and Setting the Record Straight, which all will talk about this and all have the documentary proof. Now, Jeffrey allegedly boasted of undercover work against the Russians on murder, mayhem and torture in foreign countries. And his father actually revealed that his son had lived in Egypt on government facilities for many years prior to meeting Jimi Hendrix, and bizarrely could speak fluent Russian. Now, friends of Hendrix actually suspected that Jeffrey was stealing money from him, and this actually turned out to be true. Basically, the majority of live performances that Hendrix performed in his life, Michael Jeffrey siphoned off the money and completely stole it. When he found this out, he cut all ties to Michael Jeffrey and fired him. Afterwards, Hendrix was clearly, visibly, very, very frightened, and told several people, the next time I go to Seattle will be in a pine box. This was in July 1970, and he died 2 months later. Michael Jeffrey reportedly confessed to recording engineer Alan Douglas as to his involvement in the murder of Hendrix 2 days after Hendrix's death. Now, it is believed that he murdered him because Hendrix had started supporting the Black Panthers, and he was seen as somebody who could popularise the group and bring them attention, and also bring attention to their cause. Now, in his book Rock Roadie, James Wright, a former associate to Hendrix, quoted Michael Jeffrey as admitting, "I had to do it. You know damn well what I'm talking about." Jeffrey reportedly taken out a life insurance policy against Hendrix worth £2 million, on which he was named as the main beneficiary. He took this out after he was fired. Jeffrey's actually confessed to this. He said, "I was in London on the night of Jimmy's death, and together with some of our old friends, we went round to Monica's hotel room, got a handful of pills and stuffed them into his mouth. We then poured a few bottles of red wine deep into his windpipe. I had to do it. Jimmy was worth more to me than alive. That son of a bitch was going to leave me." Now, the on-call registrar and the doctors at the time, Thomas Noguchi, a very famous guy that does autopsies in LA, examined Hendrix and noticed that there was more, his hair and his clothes were completely saturated with wine. His lungs were full of wine, his stomach was full of wine, but there was no wine in his bloodstream, meaning he hadn't drank it. It had been forced down his throat, so literally he actually drowned in wine. Now, Jeffrey basically has got connections to MI6 and also the Mafia, the CIA and the FBI, so the intelligence agency connections are clear. Now, other musicians, just rounding up here, who've served in the military include Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, John Coltrane, John Fogerty, Billy Caldwell, Lou Rawls, Jerry Reed, Woody Guthrie, B.B. King, Harry Mancini, Charlie Rich, Tony Bennett, Grover Washington Jr., Jim Croce, Bill Wyman, Lou Rawls, Artemis Pyle, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Rick James, MC Hammer, Ice-T, Shaggy, Rihanna, James Blunt, Cannabis, Fred Durst and Maynard Keenan of the band Tool. Military brats, that is people who basically have parents that are in the military, include Chris Christopherson, John Denver, all three members of the band America, Ciara, Lionel Richie, Christina Aguilera, Michael Stipe, Emma Lou Harris, Anna and Nancy Wilson of the band Heart, Marilyn Manson, Trey Songz, Pete Doherty, Engelbert Humperdinck, Elton John and Bob Marley. Now, the list of television actors that have connections to the direct links to the military-industrial complex actually dwarfs the list of musicians, but we haven't really got time to go into it now. Two that I'll give you. Everyone familiar with the picture of the three tramps in the JFK assassination? There's three people who were supposedly tramps that were being cleared away by the police, and somebody noticed that they all had $600 shoes on. And one of them was the acting head of the CIA, and two others were CIA officers. One of those is Woody Harrelson's father. Another person who is connected, his mind's gone, he's gone completely out of my brain. Blue Velvet, bloke who does that. What's his name? Thank you, Dennis Hopper. Yes, Dennis Hopper, his father was in the CIA. And you've missed this. And again, but the connections, the amount of people that are connected to the military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, or the military in these very, very specialist industries is remarkable. Now, I understand that sometimes there is a draft, sometimes people don't have a choice in these matters, but when you start to look at it, because this is an incredibly specialist area, and particularly when you look at the amount of artists that are taken to the top echelons of the industry without, frankly, deserving it, it becomes very, very strange the amount, particularly all from a similar genre, that have connections to the military-industrial complex. And hopefully, in the next half, you will see why I believe that it is that they did that. So, thank you. That confirms the first half of the talk. Thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back in a bit. Yep. Sweet. Cool. Right, by the way, I've got a website, neilsandersmindcontrol.com. There's a lot of videos on there and stuff, future events, bits and bobs, if you want to check that out. And also, if you've got any questions, comments, or anything, that's my email address. So, right. So, what were we talking about before? We were talking about LSD. So, basically, what the second half we're going to be talking about is going to be showing you my contention that the main points that started, proliferated, and then ultimately ended the 60s, the hippie movement, the flower power generation, whatever you want to call it, have all got the hallmarks of the intelligence agencies. So, we have to go back to this gentleman, Aldous Huxley. So the Tavistock Institute reportedly dabbled in... Sorry? Right. So the Tavistock Institute reportedly dabbled in LSD experimentation for several years. Initially spearheaded by brave new world author Aldous Huxley. Now, Jim Keith actually shows the evidence for this in his fabulous book, Mass Control, World Control, which is another one I'd highly recommend. Now, apparently, their aim was to introduce a euphoric drug onto the populace for the purpose of control. A drug not dissimilar to the mythic soma that Huxley wrote about in his book of Brave New World. Now, the purpose of soma was to sedate and elevate the mood of the taker, relieving all worries. Now, in the book Brave New World, which hopefully some of you have read, soma is described as a hallucinogen which allows users enjoyable, hangover-free holidays. Now, Aldous Huxley was born on the 26th of July 1894 and died 22nd of November 1963. He was an English writer with great influence in the popularisation of psychedelic substances, particularly in academic texts. Huxley actually edited the magazine Oxford Poetry, and he also published short stories, poetry, travel writing, and film stories. Now, Huxley was actually educated at prestigious Eton and later studied English literature at Balliol College, which is a constituent college of Oxford. Now, the undergraduates of Balliol are traditionally considered to be among the most politically active, and in fact, the college's alumni have got 3 British Prime Ministers. Huxley actually spent the rest of his life, the late part of his life in the United States, living in Los Angeles.
Is there anything significant in the date 22nd of November? Because we have the 22 and the 11, you get 33, don't you?
Don't know, it could be.
33, incidentally, is my birthday.
Oh. Possibly. I mean, one of the things that he did do was on his deathbed, as he was dying, he actually took 100 micrograms, which constitutes 5 strong hits of LSD. So, bearing in mind that he thought that this is a transcendental type of drug and a sort of a spiritual thing, yeah, that is entirely possible. There could be something to the death of his date that I'd not actually considered. Now, basically, the other things that Huxley was interested in, he's a humanist, a pacifist apparently, a satirist. He was also later interested in parapsychology and philosophical mysticism, and obviously he's also well known for advocating psychedelics such as mescaline, peyote and LSD. Now during the 20s, Huxley actually formed a close relationship with the author D.H. Lawrence, with whom he actually travelled around Italy and France. It is rumoured that Aldous Huxley and D.H. Lawrence were actually lovers, and it's also rumoured that Huxley was a member of the quasi-religious Nazi mystical sex cult, the Children of the Sun, or the Sonderkind as they were actually called. Now what is true is that Aldous Huxley was known to be friends with MK Ultra doctors George Estabrooks and Louis Jolly on Jolly West. Now, Huxley actually worked briefly as a teacher of French at Eton, where one of his pupils was a young Eric Blair, or George Orwell to you and I. And in October 1949, Huxley actually wrote to Orwell, who by this time had actually authored 1984, and he congratulated him on how fine and how profoundly important the book was. In the letter that he wrote to Orwell, he also said, "Within the next generation, I believe that the world's leaders will discover that infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging them and kicking them into obedience." Now in October 1930, Aleister Crowley, the English occultist and self-proclaimed most evil man in the world, was a dinner guest of Huxley's in Berlin. And rumours persist that on that evening, Crowley introduced Huxley into the psychedelic delights of peyote. He was introduced to mescaline in 1953 by the MK Ultra doctor, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who you'll remember was treating alcoholics with LSD later on that same year. And it was through Humphrey Osmond that Huxley met the millionaire Alfred Hubbard. Alfred Hubbard we'll come on to shortly, and he was one of the first people who was able to provide large quantities of LSD. Now on the 25th of December 1955, Huxley took his first dose of LSD, and he was a pioneer of the self-directed psychedelic drug use. As I briefly mentioned before, he took 5 strong doses as he lay dying on his deathbed. Now his psychedelic drug experiences are described in the essays The Doors of Perception, which we spoke about earlier, and Heaven and Hell. Doors of Perception, as I said, the doors took their name from that particular book. Heaven and Hell, he took the title from that, from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake. Now Huxley was basically one of these authors that was really championed by the hippies, and he was one of those people that basically, both of these books were required reading in the sort of Haight-Ashbury, Laurel Canyon area. Huxley famously stated, "Let us consider another type of drug capable of making people feel happy in situations where they would normally feel miserable. By making a harmless chemical euphoric freely available, a dictator could reconcile an entire population to a state of affairs to which any self-respecting human beings ought not. There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorships without tears, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution." And this speech was made for the Tavistock Institute at the behest of the Tavistock Institute at the California Medical School in 1961. Now, some would argue that LSD was actually a revolutionary and inspiring ingredient in the emergence of flower power generation and expansive consciousness. And you can't deny that certain elements of it are very good. Purple Haze, I'm the Walrus, numerous poems, songs, pieces of art, fantastic things that are coming out of that particular time. But the idea that the distribution and the production of LSD was in any way organic is a complete and total myth, I'm afraid. Now, some people are going to cite the so-called LSD cooks, the independent minds, and the psychedelic gurus as the main proponent of the spread of the use of LSD. But if we examine some of the main protagonists of this era, sadly, a rather different picture begins to emerge. And one of these gentlemen is Alfred Hubbard. Now, Aldous Huxley was actually introduced to LSD by this mysterious figure who just so happened to waft into the Haight-Ashbury area with a seemingly endless supply of hallucinogens, namely Captain Alfred Cappy Hubbard. Alfred M. Hubbard is reputed to be one of the original Johnny Appleseeds of LSD. Basically what it is, Johnny Appleseed used to go across America throwing seeds behind, and that's how America's covered in apple trees now. What Alfred Hubbard would do is essentially travel across the US, handing out his wares to anyone who was willing to participate. Hubbard was reportedly one of the first people to emphasise LSD's potential as a visionary or a transcendental drug. Now, he described his childhood as that of a poor and often barefoot hillbilly from the mountains of Kentucky. Now, in 1919, when aged just 18 here, he reportedly invented this device. This is the Hubbard Energy Transformer. It's an alleged perpetual motion device, which at the time garnered nationwide media attention. Now, how did he get the idea for this? Well, apparently 2 angels appeared to him in a vision and told him how to manufacture this fabulous device. And it was sold, he sold half the patent to the Radium Company of Pittsburgh in 1919 for $75,000, which obviously at the time was mega money. Unfortunately, this free energy device has never been seen since. Now, during the Prohibition era, Hubbard worked as a bootlegger based in Seattle. Using a taxi company as a front, he built a ship-to-shore communication device which he concealed in the boot of his cab. This was as he was transporting alcohol across the Canadian border. Now, the whole organisation got caught, and at this point there's some mystery as to the whereabouts of Hubbard. Either he was in solitary confinement for 18 months because there appears to be absolutely no record of his imprisonment, or as others have interpreted, he was actually a secret government agent that had been working for the Treasury Department all along, infiltrating the smugglers to gain evidence for prosecution. Now, adding to this is that basically just after this 18-year period, he for some reason wound up as the head of security at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas. Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas at the time was known to be run by the mafia, so he obviously runs in quite prestigious crowds. During World War II, Hubbard expanded his CV yet again. He was approached by the OSS apparently, now the CIA, and was offered a job that utilised his smuggling expertise. Basically, he was transporting war munitions into the UK. And this was suspiciously before America had actually formally entered the war. And 18 months before the attack of Pearl Harbor, Hubbard officially became a Canadian citizen as part of his cover. And he actually ended up handling millions and millions of dollars, which were laundered through the Canadian consulate in order to finance OSS and CIA operations in Europe. So again, we can see that this guy is right at the top. According to Ben Metcalf, who writes for a magazine called Vancouver, Hubbard was actually involved in the Manhattan Project, which is the development of the world's first atomic bomb, which was dropped on Nagasaki. Now, in some way, basically, he was responsible for moving uranium through Site W, which was one of the key production sites in America. Now, in a September 1980 article published in Vancouver magazine, Metcalf claimed that Al Hubbard had shown him photographs of himself accompanying the American-Canadian party into Port Radium to pick up the first shipment of uranium for the Manhattan Project. After the war, Hubbard suddenly became wealthy enough to buy his own island off the coast of Vancouver, which he called Damon Island, and he bought a fleet of boats and owned a chartered boat company and began calling himself captain. Now, in 1950, Hubbard experienced yet another angelic visitation. This time, the angels appeared to him in a vision and advised him that basically in the next year, something spectacular was going to be happening that would be an important development in the future of mankind. Now, that year he heard about Albert Hoffman's experiment with LSD, and so became convinced that this is what the angels were trying to tell him about. So he became obsessed with LSD and began a major campaign to promote it as the spiritual cure for all of humanity's problems. Now, this chap here introduced thousands of prominent people to the drug. As I say, he was one of the Johnny Appleseeds of LSD, and he went across America introducing it to scientists, politicians, intelligence agents, diplomats, church figures, people such as Aldous Huxley, Stanley Kubrick, and according to Hubbard's claims, although this has never been conclusively proved, His Holiness the Pope. Now, in Acid Dreams by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlein, they suggest that Hubbard spent much of the 1960s working for Teledyne, which was a major defence subcontractor on a secret NASA project that involved testing psychochemical agents. So, essentially, again, this guy is CIA all the way. At some unknown date, Hubbard seemingly acquired a doctorate degree from the University of Kentucky in Lexington, which is amazing because he didn't actually attend a single class, but still managed to get a doctorate, which is pretty impressive. You've got to remember as well, this is exactly the same university where Isabel Harris would experiment on predominantly black heroin addicts, so we know that this is an MK Ultra LSD experimental hospital. He listed his doctorate as part of his credentials in the 1970s when he went to work for the Tavistock Institute-directed Stanford Research Center. Now, Jim Keith of Mass Control, Will Control wrote, one associate of Hubbard's was New World Order theorist Willis Harman at the Stanford Research Institute. Stanford had earlier received grants from the US Army to research chemical incapacitants. When visited by a representative of the underground press at Stanford, Harman told the press agent, "There is a war going on between your side and mine, and my side is not going to lose." The website World Net Daily also claimed to have Freedom of Information Act requests of CIA declassified materials, documents, and other notation which indicate that Alfred Hubbard was indeed in contact with MK Ultra director Sidney Gottlieb and George Hunter White of Operation Climax fame. Now, in 1963, Captain Hubbard arrived on the doorstep of the young Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary. Hubbard was apparently dressed in military fatigues in a full uniform with a gun strapped to his leg. And Timothy Leary described this in an article in High Times. He said, "He blew in with that uniform, laying down the most incredible atmosphere of mystery and flamboyance and really impressive bullshit. He was pissed off. His Rolls Royce had broken down on the freeway, so he went to a payphone and called Rolls Royce in London. That's the sort of kind of guy he was. He started name dropping like you wouldn't believe. He claimed that he was friends with the Pope." Now, not only did LSD arrive en masse in the Haight-Ashbury area, coinciding mysteriously with the explosion of youth-driven rebellious music, but so did several other previously classified chemical formulas designed to produce a cornucopia of hallucinogenic effects. Now, these strange new drugs also found their way into the hands of the newly formed and highly experimental flower power generation. The Dow Chemical Company develops an incredibly potent hallucinogen called STP, the effects of which rendered the user semi-conscious for days at a time. Now, STP was used solely as an incapacitating agent by the CIA and therefore was classified top secret. That is, until the formula was released to the throngs of young people desperate for new sensations on the streets of San Francisco. Similarly, phencyclidine, or PCP, also known as angel dust, prepared by the multinational corporation Park Davis as an animal tranquilizer, mysteriously found its way into the hands of hippies streaming towards the Haight-Ashbury area. For those that don't know, phencyclidine, or PCP, angel dust, is also embalming fluid. One of the side effects of smoking PCP is that you embalm your lungs from the inside out. Now, according to a former CIA contract employee, agency personnel helped underground chemists set up LSD laboratories during the Summer of Love to monitor events in the acid ghetto. But why, if this assertion is true, would the CIA be interested in keeping tabs on the hippie population? Law enforcement is not a plausible explanation, as there were already far enough narcs operating in the Haight-Ashbury area. So what was the motive? Well, a CIA agent who claims to have infiltrated the covert network provided a clue when he referred to the entire Haight-Ashbury area as a giant human guinea pig farm. MK Ultra Dr. Lewis Jolly on Jolly West also lived in the Haight-Ashbury district in 1967. Apparently he was merely there to observe the hippie in his natural environment. We can only speculate on the true nature of his being there. Eustace Mullins, now passed away, some people may know, he wrote about the Federal Reserve, wrote of the Tavistock Institute's influence on American culture, the financing that went into the foundation of the hippie movement, in the appendix of his book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. The present drug culture of the United States is traced in its entirety to this one institute, which supervised the Central Intelligence Agency's training programs. The LSD counterculture originated when Sandoz, a Swiss pharmaceutical house owned by S.G. Warburg & Co., developed a new drug from lysergic acid. James Paul Warburg, son of Paul Warburg, who had written the Federal Reserve Act, financed a subsidiary of the Tavistock Institute in the United States called the Institute for Policy Studies, whose director Marcus Raskin was appointed to the National Security Council. James Paul Warburg then set up a CIA program to experiment with LSD on CIA agents and the general public. Now, Aldous Huxley tellingly noted, "The 21st century will be the age of controllers. The older dictators failed because they could never supply their subjects with enough bread, enough circuses. Under a scientific dictatorship, men will grow to love their servitude." Now, it's actually been alleged that Aldous Huxley actually approached the acid guru Timothy Leary and convinced him to form a secret society whose purpose it was to spread the Enlightenment message of LSD. Huxley apparently wanted to employ a psychedelic conspiracy to covertly influence or brainwash powerful members of society for the betterment of mankind. Huxley apparently said to Leary, "Initiate and ensnare artists, writers, poets, jazz musicians, elegant courtesans, and then they will educate the intelligent rich." So this is where and why you're getting all these military-industrial complex members of music groups. Now, the members who formed the group, the Warlocks, which was later named the Grateful Dead, were also test subjects in MKUltra LSD experiments at Palo Alto in 1962. Furthermore to this, in 1968 FBI memo confirmed that Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead is a CIA asset. It said, "The Grateful Dead are employed to channel youth dissent and rebellion into more benign and non-threatening directions. They perform a vital service in distracting many young people into drugs and mysticism and away from politics." This is not a guy, this is not a guitarist that was approached by the CIA. This is a CIA agent that was told to pick up a guitar. Robert Hunter, who also wrote the lyrics for the Grateful Dead, along with Ken Kesey, was a volunteer in MKUltra tests at Stanford University, and they were paid to take LSD, psilocybins and mescaline and then report on their experiences. Now Robert Hunter, who wrote lyrics to the Grateful Dead, claimed that the LSD basically was highly influential in his lyrics. So here's an example of his lyrics. Let's see if you think they might have had an effect. "Sit back, picture yourself swooping up a shell of purple with foam crests of crystal, drops soft nigh they fall into the sea of morning, creep very softly mist. And then, sort of cascade, tinkly bell-like, and then conglomerate suddenly into a peal of silver vibrant, uncomprehendingly blood-singling, joyously resounding bells. By my faith, if this be insanity, then for the love of God permit me to remain insane." Lovely. By 1953, through the front organisation, the Society for Human Ecology, which dealt directly with Joe Bias's father, the CIA had been sponsoring research into the effects of LSD, psilocybin and mescaline at Harvard University and several sites in San Francisco, Oakland and the Oakland area, including Stanford and Berkeley. Funding was at least to the tune of $25 million, but probably closer to $35 million, and this was in 1953. So in today's money, it's billions. Timothy Leary, the acid champion, LSD champion, and counterculture hero, conducted all of his acid-based experiments at Harvard University under the sponsorship of the CIA. In his autobiography, Flashbacks, Leary credited CIA agent Cord Meyer with helping him to understand his political cultural role more clearly. For those who don't know, Cord Meyer's main role at the CIA was part of Operation Mockingbird. People who don't know that Operation Mockingbird is to influence the media with false stories or stories that would benefit the CIA. So when you get these, they're agent provocateurs within the media, essentially. And one of the first people to introduce Leary to LSD was CIA agent and longtime friend Frank Barron. So Cord Meyer and Frank Barron were the two CIA agents who basically started Timothy Leary's career. Leary actually confirmed in an interview with Walter Bauer, "You look back, many things that we thought were accidents turned out they were not. The entire LSD movement itself was sponsored originally by the CIA, to whom I give great credit. 80% of the decisions I made were suggested to me by CIA people. I liked the CIA. Yes, I was a willing agent of the CIA. Now, similar to Ewan Cameron and William Sargent, Leary experimented with removing and replacing behaviour patterns, writing a paper in 1963 entitled How to Change Behaviour. So when we're talking about wiping memory, it's exactly what Timothy Leary was doing. At Harvard, Leary's mentor was chief psychologist Harry A. Murray. Harry A. Murray in the 1940s was employed to develop personality tests for the CIA. And he also had the honour of advising as he monitored military experiments on truth drug, brainwashing, hypnotism and interrogation techniques. That's the person that taught Timothy Leary what taught him his trade. Timothy Leary also came from a military background, surprise, surprise. His father being a veteran of the US Army. Leary himself joined the US Military Academy at West Point in the early 1940s and served as a sergeant in the medical corps during World War II. Timothy Leary's philosophical guru was this gentleman, Michael Hollingshead. And it was Hollingshead who apparently first provided Leary with a steady supply of LSD on a large-scale basis. Hollingshead was known to be an MI6 agent who it would seem was sent to indoctrinate and coax Leary, apparently at the behest of Aldous Huxley and the Tavistock Institute. Michael Hollingshead is another of these LSD Johnny Appleseeds, so we've got him and we've got Alfred Hubbard. The people that Michael Hollingshead apparently was reputed to have introduced to LSD are Timothy Leary, William S. Burroughs, Roman Polanski, Allen Ginsberg, Donovan, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, Charlie Mingus, artist Saul Steinberg, philosopher Alan Watts, and the Beatles, Paul McCartney, John Lennon and George Harrison. In fact, the episode where Hollingshead provided acid for the Beatles, reportedly laced into icing sugar, which was then put in their coffee, is actually in the Lennon biography. It says, Spring 1965, John Lennon, Cynthia, George Harrison and Pattie Boyd inadvertently take their first LSD trip when a dentist friend of Harrison, supplied by the LSD Johnny Appleseed Michael Hollingshead, spikes their coffee. Now Lennon was no fool. He actually spoke to Playboy about acid. This is when was the last time he'd done acid, and he said, and this was in 1980, he said, "Not in years. A little mushroom or peyote is not beyond my scope, you know. Maybe twice a year or something. We don't hear about it anymore, but people are still visiting the cosmos. We must always remember to thank the CIA and the Army for LSD. That's what people forget. Everything is the opposite of what it is, isn't it, Harry? So get out the bottle, boy, and relax. They invented LSD to control people, and what they did was give us freedom. Sometimes it works in mysterious ways. It's wonders to perform. If you look to the government reports on acid, the ones who jumped out the window or killed themselves because of it, I think even with Diane Linklater, it happened to her years later. So let's face it, she wasn't really on acid when she jumped out the window. I've never met anybody who's had a flashback. I've never had a flashback in my life, and I took millions of trips in the 60s. That interview was actually published just shortly after he was killed by a mind-controlled subject. Well, actually he was killed by Jose Paderno, but let's not get into that now. Diane Linklater as well, she was on acid at the time she went through the window, but she certainly didn't jump, she was thrown through it. I forget the name of the chap that did it, but he also was with another Hollywood starlet who also killed herself by jumping out of a window many years later. Now, in an interview for High Times magazine in February 1972, sorry, just to go back to that, so John Lennon's absolutely right. LSD did not work. It did not provide the mythical soma that they wanted. So what did they do? Well, they did certain other things to destroy the 60s, which we're going to come on to now. Timothy Leary said, if you look back, many things that we thought were accidents turned out were not accidents. The entire LSD movement itself was sponsored originally by the CIA. I would not be here today if it had not been for the foresight and prestige of CIA psychologists. So I give the CIA credit for being truly an intelligent agency. Researcher Walter Bauer, who's the author of Operation Mind Control, interviewed Leary in the 70s, and he had some very interesting things to say. Bauer asked him, do you think CIA people were involved in your group in the 60s? And Leary responded, Of course they were. I would say that 80% of my movements, 80% of my decisions I made were suggested to me by CIA people. I like the CIA. Their game they're playing is better than the FBI, better than Franco's police, better than the Saigon police, better than the Israeli police. They're 1,000 times better than the KGB. So it comes down to this. Who are you going to work for? The Yankees or the Dodgers? Now when Timothy Leary left Harvard, he was lucky enough to immediately find a position. When he left Harvard, Leary began to work for William Mellon Hitchcock, who founded the CIA front group, the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, which was later renamed the Castiala Foundation. Hitchcock was well positioned to help Leary with the vast wealth that came from his enviable position as the heir to the Gulf Oil Company fortune. When Leary was no longer welcome to conduct LSD experiments at Harvard, he was paid $2,000 a month and provided accommodation to live and conduct his psychedelic research on the 2,500-acre Mellon Hitchcock estate in New York community of Millbrook. William Mellon Hitchcock was a graduate of the University of Vienna and a descendant of the millionaire Mellon banking family of Pittsburgh. His ancestor, Andrew Mellon, had risen to the position of US Treasury Secretary during the Prohibition era. Now, in order to help Leary, Hitchcock contacted the British Charles Bruce chemical firm, probably a front for MI6, to import large quantities of the chemical components required for the manufacture of LSD. In 1967, Hitchcock made contact with the infamous, Owsley Stanley, at the recommendation of his friend Dr. Albert. And through Owsley, Hitchcock engaged the law firm of Babinetz, Bowden and Stanley 27, reportedly to determine which Caribbean country would be the best present location for the production and distribution of large quantities of LSD and hashish. So what happened was when people were getting wise to the fact that the CIA was sponsoring Timothy Leary at Harvard, he moved out, but as luck would have it, this elite banking family managed to basically say, yeah, it's fine, you come along and do all your experimentation on our estate. Owsley Stanley is also known as one of the Johnny Appleseeds of LSD, also known as the Bear, due to his particularly hirsute figure. He was one of reportedly the first independent source to produce large quantities of pure LSD, and he is fabled to have personally produced 1/2 kilogram of LSD, which translates to 5 million hits. Although accounts of his output vary wildly, some people have said that he's made as much as 20 million hits of LSD. What is undisputed, however, is that the widespread and low-cost availability of Stanley's high-quality LSD in the San Francisco area in the mid-side 1960s was essential for the proliferation of the hippie scene. And again, more often than not, his samples were given away free. The Jimi Hendrix song Purple Haze is named after Stanley's Monterey Purple Acid. Other famed varieties that he produced were White Lightning, Blue Cheer and the infamous Orange Sunshine, which we'll talk about in a second. He is also the person that provided the Beatles with their LSD when they were filming the Magical Mystery Tour. And he also provided the acid to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest novelist Ken Kesey and his collection of merry pranksters, whose they basically, in 1964, there was this thing called the psychedelic bus trip, which was called the electric Kool-Aid acid test. So we got in a bus, took a load of acid, and went up and down America promoting it. And this was reported in a book by Tom Wolfe. It was on this tour that he actually met the Grateful Dead in 1966, and he struck up a great friendship. Stanley ended up actually funding them and became a sound engineer and their manager. Owsley Stanley also designed the Grateful Dead's skull, lightning bolt logo. Now, he's a good guy with Stanley. He provided 10,000 doses of LSD for the 1967 Be In Festival, 14,000 doses of LSD for the Monterey Pop Festival, and a further 14,000 hits of LSD for the Altamont Festival. Now, despite each of these batches having a street value somewhere in the region of between $20,000 and $30,000, Stanley provided his wares completely gratis. Do you remember we said that STP was mysteriously released from Edgware Arsenal onto the streets of San Francisco? The chemist that released it was Owsley Stanley. What is strange is that the only place that he could have got this recipe from was the Edgware Arsenal, which we all know by now was the childhood home of Frank Zappa. He was born Augustus Owsley Stanley, and his grandfather of the same name was the governor of Kentucky. He was also a US senator and a congressman. His father was also a veteran of active service in the US Army, and after his parents separated, he was sent to military school. Nicknamed Bear when he was at school, he was actually expelled from the Charlotte Military Academy for bringing alcoholic beverages onto campus and getting his classmates drunk. He also spent more than a year as a patient at St. Elizabeth Psychiatric Hospital in Washington, which is where George Hunter White performed truth serum experiments. He later joined the US Air Force and his electronics training there leading to work on radio stations in Los Angeles, whilst also rather eclectically training and performing as a professional ballet dancer. Now, in 1963, he enrolled at the University of California and started a fledgling business selling morning glory seeds, which were a quite mild hallucinogen. The next year, he actually encountered LSD and was so enthused by the compound's effect that he spent 3 weeks studying the then legal drug's chemistry and began producing it himself. He left college and took up work at a local radio station and spent his spare time founding the Bear Research Group, which he used to make large quantities, industrial scale quantities of LSD, by the kilo essentially. This was where he met author Ken Kesey, and through his connections became the first private producer of LSD who was able to produce large quantities of the drug. Now, the way he did it was really ridiculously bold. Him and his associate Tim Scully built a laboratory in San Francisco and basically just started to just produce it like any old normal factory. In 1966, when it became illegal, basically he moved it to a secret hidden location inside the Denver Zoo. Now, Stanley was actually really bold. In order to make sure that he knew where his stash was at all times, he carried around in a suitcase. There was literally hundreds of thousands of tabs. In 1967, he was arrested with this suitcase. At the time, it held 350 separate LSD tabs, which he steadfastly maintained were for personal use. He was also apprehended when he was on tour with the Grateful Dead for possession of LSD, and this arrest violated his bail condition and resulted. In 1970, he was eventually sent to prison for 3 years. Yet again, however, the same connections to wealth, high society, mental health institutions, the military and the intelligence agencies are a running thread through the lives of the key figures of the scene. So, LSD, what have they got? Okay, they've got something they don't really know how to control. So how do they control it? Well, this is how they control it. It would appear there are several aspects and several things that basically killed the 60s. Manson family, Manson killings, Altamont, and the arrest of the Rolling Stones and the death of Brian Jones. I'm going to show you now how all of these are intimately linked with the CIA. Now, it appears that the Manson family's own supply of LSD came directly from the CIA. Orange Sunshine was being used exclusively by Manson and his entourage during their many drug sessions in the desert. And in his biography, Charles Tex Watson wrote that it was this particularly potent Orange Sunshine LSD that finally convinced him and others of Manson's violent apocalyptic vision. In the Ed Sanders book, The Family, Manson killed Gypsy and also several others, tellingly revealed that long hikes in the desert were eased by their supply of strong sunshine. Now, the Manson family could have only got this from one source, which was Anthony Stanley. Now, what's interesting about the Manson family and the truth behind the slayings, the Tate LaBianca killings, they're very, very different from the thing. And we haven't really got enough time to do it. If anyone wants to come and talk to me, I'll talk to you all day about the Manson family. That's what my next book's going to be about. One of the principal things that people don't realise is that Manson, Charles Manson, king of the hippies, was in no way a hippie, nor was he a fan of the Beatles. He was a fan of Bing Crosby. He didn't actually like the Beatles that much. In the 1973 documentary Manson, family member Brooks Posner revealed that Charlie openly mocked the hippies as asking for trouble and encouraged all the men at Spine Ranch to cut their hair and dress more conservatively. Even hardcore members of the so-called family described themselves as slippies, distinct from the hippie culture. Now, this did not stop the powers that be using this cult leader image to direct and destroy the ideology of the love generation, forever tying the concept of communal living to murderous sex cults. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious. Listen to the Beatles and do LSD, see what happens to your kids. That's essentially what it was there for. The other thing is, He's got long hair here. He'd been in Death Valley for about 2 months at this time. Before this time, look at pictures of Charlie Manson. He never had long hair and never, well actually once in a Life magazine cover, but rarely wore a beard. When he was in jail, what people don't realise is that his trial was a year before it actually went to trial, and at the time he was refused scissors and a razor, so that when they could present him in trial, he looked like Jesus. And they could say that he had said he was Jesus, and that then they could present him as a hippie cult leader. He never said he was Jesus. The police called him Jesus. One of his associates was a name called Christopher or Zero. Christopher, Christ. He was Mexican, so they called him Jesus, Jesus, because he's Mexican. They were looking for Zero at the Spartan Ranch, couldn't find him, found Charlie, says, I'm not, where's this Jesus fellow? He says, I'm not, I'm Manson. This is Manson, the son of man, man's son, that's you, and arrested him. They later released him because they got the wrong person, but that stayed on his record that his name was Jesus Christ. That's where it comes from. Now, in the Helter Skelter, the book by mafia-linked prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, it actually discusses Manson's so-called programming techniques in depth, and it likens much of his ability to the US military. What's interesting is that Manson apparently learned any techniques that he did have from two places: the Esalen Institute, which is a Tavistock Institute-run developmental transcendental meditation place in California, and from Scientology. He actually received over 150 hours of auditing from a Scientologist in prison, and raised himself to the level of theta level clear, which is the highest level of Scientology. Tom Cruise, L. Ron Hubbard, and Charles Manson, they're theta level clear, basically. Now, Manson was in various prisons during the time that the CIA was known to be using these methods, say Vacaville and numerous other institutions in MKUltra experiments. And he was actually moved to Vacaville in 1974 and placed next door to Timothy Leary. Now, the details of this cause one to speculate that perhaps Manson was some sort of mind-controlled guru created by the CIA and set loose against subversive left-wing elements in order to discredit them. I don't know whether it was mind control, but what we can certainly all agree on is that Manson's image was used to demonise the hippies, demonise the Beatles, and to also just destroy the Love Power generation. Here's an interesting thing. The Abbey Road photo shoot, where the Beatles are making the Freemasonic sign across the Abbey Road, across the black and white. Everyone understands that's a Freemasonic symbol, yeah? That was on August the 8th. That photo was taken at exactly the same time that Sharon Tate was being murdered by Charles Tex Watson. Coincidence? No. John Lennon had come out and started saying stuff, so they used this guy to destroy the Beatles and destroy any potency that he had. And this was the key. Orange Sunshine LSD was manufactured and distributed exclusively by a group known as the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who operated outside of Los Angeles. Now, the Brotherhood had among its drug manufacturers and dealers one Ronald Stark, who was believed to have manufactured 50 million doses of LSD and had known connections to the CIA. Timothy Leary was also involved in the group and has connections to the CIA, and Owsley Stanley was the principal LSD cook for the Brotherhood. Now, Sunshine mysteriously reared its head during another seminal moment of the 60s, namely the drug bust on the Rolling Stones in February 1967. On the evening immediately prior to the police bust, the Stones had been provided with drugs by a new member of their entourage, a shadowy figure named David Schneiderman. Mick Jagger described him as a dark and sinister Yank. Schneiderman owned numerous passports of various nationalities and a suitcase filled with orange sunshine. Marianne Faithfull, who was famously arrested at the time wearing nothing but a rug and a Mars bar, if you believe the urban myth, described the events to historian A.E. Hotchner. He said, Schneiderman came to our rooms and distributed orange sunshine. By the afternoon, we all began to emerge from our rooms floating on the LSD. This, along with the fact that Schneiderman managed to leave the flat with his suitcase unsearched, with the permission of the police, never to be seen again, suggests that he had intelligence agency connections. Keith Richards always felt that Schneiderman set him up, and actually, basically a couple of months before Christmas, this actually came out in the British press, finally, it was a COINTELPRO thing. So MI5 were involved, the CIA were involved in providing the LSD, And the FBI, under the directorship of J. Edgar Hoover, basically COINTELPRO was a counterintelligence program to stop left-wing activists. You know, it could have been worse. They killed a lot of the Black Panthers. These guys who basically just threatened them with jail and murdered Brian Jones. Now, in 1968, a gentleman named Phil Kaufman became the Rolling Stones tour manager. Now, Kaufman had the distinction of being a jailhouse cellmate of none other than our good friend Charles Manson. Kaufman maintained his friendship with Manson after his release and described himself as a sympathetic cousin to the family. Phil Kaufman was actually immortalised in a film that some of you might have seen. It's called Grand Theft Parsons, and it details the true story of Phil Kaufman stealing the corpse of musician Graham Parsons, who we may remember from the first part, and transporting it in the boot of his car across state lines. In the film, Phil Kaufman was played by the ringleader of the Jackass television show, Johnny Knoxville. In his book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, journalist Hunter S. Thompson describes using a particularly powerful type of sunshine LSD. Now, whether or not this is the fabled orange sunshine is unclear, but I think it was. What is clear, however, is that the LSD was particularly potent, causing Thompson to believe that the other guests of the hotel that he was staying in had turned into giant alien reptiles. Later in the book, his companion Dr. Gonzo uses this same powerful batch of LSD to disorientate a preteen girl so that he can force her to have sex. Now in Altamont, it was the very same type of LSD, orange sunshine, which saturated the fateful free concert at Altamont Speedway in 1969. 4 people died during the concert, one of them being brutally stabbed to death by a group of Hells Angels. The Hells Angels have been given multiple tabs of orange sunshine. Yeah, basically, this is one of the first snuff films. If you actually watch the film, it looks like it's done. They killed him during Sympathy for the Devil, which was actually surprisingly early in the set, and this dead guy sat there for the entire thing. Also, they claim he whips out a gun. I've watched that. I'm not convinced that guy had a gun, to be quite honest. Now, the people who attended the Altamont Speedway concert noted the LSD seemed to be contaminated. And the general vibe one got from it was that of extreme negativity, violence and death. Supplies of Thorazine, administered to calm users on a bad trip, ran out within the first couple of hours, leaving thousands of participants at the mercy of this particularly potent drug. This eventually turned into essentially the worst trip ever. Now, the LSD arrived from Berkeley and was also laced with amphetamines, which seemingly added to the nightmarish results. Over 1,000 hits were distributed free to the Hells Angels, who famously provided security for the event. Little known fact, but this must be pointed out, at the time the Hells Angels were in the employ of the American intelligence agencies. The ATF hired the Hells Angels founder Sonny Barger as an informant and a hitman. Barger was employed in attempts on the life of Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver and farm labour activist Cesar Chavez. He failed in the second hit due to being incarcerated on a previous murder charge. This thing about the Hells Angels, straight Satan, Satan slaves, all these gangs that we think are really anti-establishment, let us not forget where the Hells Angels started. The Hells Angels started ex-servicemen coming back from the Second World War. Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels volunteered to take the Hells Angels into Vietnam to clear up the communist problem. This is not an anti-establishment group. Orange sunshine was also reportedly heavily used by American ground forces during the Vietnam War, having been smuggled into the country from the California coast. Now that is a particularly impressive feat for essentially the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, who are apparently a ragtag bunch of about 20 hippies operating out the back of a VW van. Timothy Leary, along with CIA agent Ronald Stark, went to work in organising the distribution wing of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love's operation. Now Stark, who was, remember, he made 50 million doses for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, he was arrested for drug trafficking in 1975 in Bologna in Italy. And the magistrate Giorgio Floridia ordered that Ronald Stark be released immediately on the grounds that he was a CIA agent and had been since 1960. Now, Stark helped Leary found the quasi-religious Brotherhood of Eternal Love as a cover for the distribution of the CIA's very potent Orange Sunshine LSD. And its members included many of the volunteers who were involved at the Millbrook estate, and Hitchcock's money and facilities were instrumental in the success of getting this acid out. As heir to the country's wealthiest family, Hitchcock had both the capital and the international connections needed to transform acid manufacturing from a centralised cottage industry into big business. And these are members of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. That's them. That's all of them. Now, in the beginning, the Brotherhood handed out many free samples of LSD to promote the product. By the middle of 1969, the organisation had reportedly distributed 10 million hits of Orange Sunshine alone. One of those hired by the organisation as a distributor was Daniel Baranski. At the time, he was a homeless runaway, aged 12 in 1969. Several years later, Daniel was arrested in a smuggling operation involving US military personnel moving marijuana from Southeast Asia to California. Leary was eventually arrested with Joanna Harcourt Smith, who also admitted working for the DEA. When Charles Manson was placed in solitary confinement at Folsom Prison, he was also visited by his good friend who was placed in an adjoining cell, his good friend Timothy Leary. So, Timothy Leary, CIA agent, Ronald Stark, CIA agent, Alfred Hubbard, CIA agent, Michael Hollingshead, MI6 agent, Cord Meyer, CIA agent, Frank Barron, CIA agent, Schneiderman, CIA agent, Ronald Stark, CIA agent. There is a pattern here. I've not quite got it yet, but there is some sort of running theme through all of these people. Anyway, Timothy Leary had this to say about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. He said, the whole concept of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love is like a bogeyman invented by the narcs. The Brotherhood was about 8 surfer kids from Southern California who took the LSD and practiced the religion of the worship of nature. And they'd go into the mountains, but there were no big shots at all. None of them ever drove anything better than a VW bus. They were just kind of in it for the spiritual thrill. Now that may well be Timothy Leary's explanation for the thing, but to be quite honest, this does not seem to tie in with the huge amounts of drugs that they were able to distribute, not only to manufacture illegally, but also to distribute. If they can make their wares stretch as far as Vietnam, then this is more than 20 surfer kids in the back of a VW van. But hopefully what that does is illustrate that basically throughout the 60s the proliferation of LSD was starting to be a controlling influence like Soma, like the mythical Soma from A Brave New World. It was there. The hippies essentially came in to move people away from the anti-war movement, to turn people into navel-gazing lotus eaters rather than people who were actively entrenched in politics. The anti-war movement and the flower power generation and the hippies are very separate things. I haven't got them here, but I can find you many, many quotes of people who were involved in the anti-war movement that felt that the hippies were a detriment to their cause, because essentially all they encouraged was selfish behaviour. Not that was the intention, but that was the direction that it was led into. And so hopefully what this talk has shown you is that basically the foundation of the flower power generation, the proliferation, the fermentation, and then ultimately the destruction of the flower power generation, the 60s anti-war movement, and what can be loosely termed as the hippie movement, was sadly all an experiment by the intelligence agencies. Well, that concludes my talk, so thank you very much. Again, this is my website if anybody wants to check it out. This is my email if you want to get in touch. Those are my books over there if anyone would like to buy my books. And if we've got any time, if anyone's got any questions, I'm quite happy to answer any questions. Yep?
Well, it's not really questions, it's just a few points. The whole musical movement of the 60s, very talented.
Well, no, actually.
This is the point I want to make.
Yeah.
The perception is a lot of very talented people.
Yeah.
As you point out, all coming from the same military background. That would point to a hidden hand.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things...
Where I get away from where you were coming from, slightly, the Beatles. I agree that the Tavistock Institute are well behind a lot of this. I'd ask people to look into Theodore Adorno.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So it seems to me that these people, apart from being talented musicians who just come from natural talent, there's definitely the Tavistock Institute behind them promoting a certain type of music.
Oh yeah, it's more than that. It's like, you know, the Byrds did not play on their first album. The majority of the Laurel Canyon bands, including some of the Doors tracks actually, they didn't play on their first albums. You know why? Because they weren't very good musicians. The proliferation of the Laurel Canyon scene was more due to a bloke called Vito Paulenkus and his group of dancers called the Freaks. Right? Before anybody was established, because essentially this is a small cottage industry, no one's got any albums out, so nobody outside of this particular small area knows about these bands, the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, all the Crosby, Stills and Nash, all of these bands, okay? Why are people attracted to the gigs? They're attracted to the gigs by this group of people who were friends with Kenneth Anger, the Satanist, called Vito Paulenkus and the Freakers. And what they do is they would turn up at all these gigs and dance like maniacs and possibly have a loving on the dance floor. People would turn up to watch the Freaks as opposed to watching the bands. And even David Crosby admits this in his biography, that essentially all of the Laurel Canyon bands weren't very good, so you had to have this hype to draw people in until they were established, essentially. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Anyone else?
Are MK Ultra still in operation?
Are MK Ultra still in operation?
If so, what do they do?
Probably. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I don't know for a fact. I was told by Ted Gunston when I was had a conversation with him that Monarch, which is the sex slave aspect of MK Ultra, has been renamed Marathon. I don't know whether that's true. I really don't know. Yes, I would imagine so. I don't know if it's happening in England. Well, the last thing that was sort of mind controlling in England was those two ladies that threw themselves under the lorry on the motorway. Dunblane, obviously, that's a bit strange. So yeah, if I had to stake a claim to what they do with MK Ultra and mind control subjects now, they're sending them into schools with a sort like this. Yeah, absolutely. There's a large part in my book about Columbine and Virginia Tech, and it falls into roughly two categories. Columbine, I'll tell you for a fact, there was at least 4 shooters at Columbine, at least 2 of whom were still students at the school and were named by several other members of the school as saying that bloke was shot my friend earlier. And the teacher said, shut up.
It's the same with
Sandy Hook, something very strange. Yeah, something very strange has happened with Sandy Hook. But yeah, it's Columbine, Virginia Tech. The common thread that runs through all of these things is it works in several ways. It's a mind control program in as much as it stops people, it's a public perception management event, fear, get rid of guns, that sort of thing. The people themselves might well be mind control subjects, and then the concept of what's sold to the media is often sort of twisted as well, because basically they'll tell you that this is what happened. One kid went mad, went into school, shot it, when the evidence points to several more people being involved and stuff like that. So the mind control element is broad.
Is the end game now to disarm the thing?
Probably, yeah. And just to... Tavistock have got this thing called fear. You get fear and stuff on people all the time. You basically get people trauma-based mind control on a large scale, and this is how you get whole populations. You can't think, you can be terrified by something horrible, you revert to fight or flight, and you're not going to have a long and complicated go through the facts and the options at that point, so you just react and go, someone from authority, please come and help me, quickly. So that's it. Yes, please.
Peter Hutchins has observed that all the school shootings are the result of drugs.
Yeah, there's the SSRI aspect of it.
Anyway, another point, not last summer, the summer before in Belgium, I was in Bavaria, and they had that a great big concert, and it got blasted by somebody. Well, that was the real classic freak out.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, you know...
Well, it got all slashed by that storm, that's what I'm talking about.
Oh, with the stage collapse? Yeah, I do remember that. But what the gentleman said was about drugs. The majority of school shooters, people that are involved in school shootings, miraculously they end up being on SSRI, antidepressants, fluoxetine, Prozac, all of these various different bits and bobs. That seems to be a running theme. Even on the boxers, it says this can cause suicidal and violent tendencies. So whether that, I don't know, because that certainly is a running theme, but I don't know whether that is a cover story, if you know what I mean, because that, There are all other techniques that could be used to turn people into mind-controlled killers. The use of drugs in those particular aspects, no doubt, it heightens certain aspects, but that to me would be too random an event. Certain things like Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, there's dates involved, there's significance involved, the number of victims, the way people are killed, the time people are killed. Some of them have got ritual aspects to them. So I don't think they rely just on the drugs, but I think that maybe the drugs are useful in hypnotic processes or in other ways that you could gain control of the person. Anybody else?
I think the parallels are there, for this country, not just America, towards the 70s, early 80s.
Oh yeah.
Where a lot of our youth were getting involved in politics, obviously controlled from both left and right, very active. All of a sudden it becomes very, very easy for our youth to get access to drugs.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, CND was the one that was completely bothered by authorities and stuff like that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is my sort of thought. Drugs don't come in by accident. Where do they all of a sudden come from? I mean, look at things like the most recent one we've had is like all these legal drugs and stuff like that. Prior to that, in the 90s, obviously, it was ecstasy was the new drug that came in. Ecstasy's not a new drug. Ecstasy was a truth drug that was used in Switzerland. MDA is what it was called. That's what Wojciech Wachowski had loads of in the Manson killings. So ecstasy is not a new drug, but it's the perception that it's a new drug. It's, again, channeling of youth energy. The problem, in my mind, the problem with ecstasy was people, not only did they stop fighting they stopped fighting the powers that be, which is great for the powers that be. They want stop fighting each other. One of the interesting things about ecstasy, quality, and football hooliganism is it goes like this. Okay, football hooliganism is like, aside from the organised crime aspects of it, it's just another good way of getting like groups of people knocking seven shades out of each other. I mean, sporting itself is one of these ludicrous things where people will kill each other over a colour of a football team, stuff like that. So yeah, I think it's all connected, and I think these drug exposures. One of the tragic things, right? Okay, one of the really tragic things about doing drugs, okay, is you think that you're being really rebellious, you think that you're being anti-establishment, you think you're being like, look at me, sticking it to the man, smoking this or whatever. Who do you think brought it in? Who do you think that money's going to? Yeah, it's going to go to Dodgy John down the road, but then it's going to go up to him and go up to him, because Dodgy John hasn't got a boat. Dodgy John has not got a plane, right, okay? Nobody's got it. We look at the places where drug proliferation is the worst. Harlem, central Los Angeles, Brixton, places like this, right, okay? Nobody in those places has got nobody's got the wherewithal to get that amounts of material in. It's ridiculous. You just go, the famous one is Gary Webb, crack. The whole point of crack was to demonise and kill off young black men. Simple as. And you tie that in with the concept of gangster rap, death row records, and this concept, you demonise it. You tell young black men that this is the best you're going to hope for. You also tell them that there's quite a lot of money to be made out of this. But then other people, like middle-class white people, look at any black guy that's dressed in a certain way. These genes tell you that you're dealing drugs. That's the concept that it's gone back to. And again, the crack, where's it coming in? The crack's coming in directly from the Medellin, by the CIA. People like Gary Webb spoke about it in Dark Alliance. It's being brought in through Mena, Arkansas, by Bill and Hillary Clinton. That's it. These are the drug dealers. These are the major drug dealers in America.
There was one strange problem, though, with heroin. That appeared in Blackpool in 1982, almost overnight.
Yeah.
Huge quantities. Now, either some dealer found a way of bringing it in the country or so important.
Yeah.
It did seem quite strange. I remember talking to a university lecturer, he was saying, it appeared in London in 1981. Now, his lecturer at the time, when he was doing Baywatch, was convinced that was government law to bring it in to stop the riots.
I'm sure it was.
Again, this, it's theories, but I was always surprised in Blackpool how it just appeared. There was no heroin in Blackpool in 1981. Zero. You never saw them. Then all of a sudden, you hit the streets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. Drugs are directed. Like, it's no. You're absolutely right. Like, they come in swathes and stuff like that. when it starts doing stuff that they don't want to do, when it starts getting 20 groups of former football hooligans taking their tops off and hugging each other, that's no good, is it? Okay, so we need to get rid of that. What we need to bring in is cocaine. That's good now. That's what we want now, because it's dead glamorous, isn't it? So we'll go out there and it's all right because it's got that nasty violent edge to it. And this is how it works. You're absolutely correct. Yes?
Going at the front brought up the significance of the August Huxley.
Yeah.
It's the same day JFK was assassinated. Is there a connection?
Sorry, big phone?
It's the same day JFK was assassinated. Is there a connection?
Oh, I don't know. I did not know that. What, the day that he died?
Yeah, 22nd of November 1963.
Oh, well, thank you for pointing. I had not noticed that, to be quite honest. But yeah, apparently August Huxley died on the day that Kennedy died. He was probably getting out. He probably knew what was going to happen, and getting out on the game was good. Anyone else? Yeah?
Yeah, you're sort of vaguely pointing the finger at the military industrial complex. Perhaps it's a bit unfair. Obviously, it's a lot more pervasive and pernicious. Where does the book start?
Where does the book start? I don't know. Who directs it? I don't know. It's got to be the very top echelons. I mean, if you look at it, you've basically got elite families. For want of a better word, Illuminati. Because essentially you've got the same banking scions, the same sort of top level people that have been in charge since way back. SS formed the OSS, formed the CIA. The Nazi connection is a fact. The Nazi party founded by the Wall Street, Paul Warburg and all these people, where they went on to found Tavistock. Tavistock then, through Paul Warburg, gets the Mellon family involved, Timothy Leary, boom. So, where it stops, don't know, but certainly the Kennedys, certainly the Rockefellers, certainly the Rothschilds, certainly the Heisberg Schlesers, certainly the, what are they called? Saxberg-Gothers, certainly all of these. And you know why we know that? Because they haven't moved. They've been there since whenever, you know, year dot. They've been in charge, and they're still in charge. And now all their relatives are in the music industry, or they're in the film industry. So all these people that are presented to you, you can be just like this. You can be just like your heroes. You can, if you were born and happen to be related to, hey Christ, Madonna, Tom Hanks, Celine Dion, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Angelina Jolie, George Bush, Dick Cheney, Barack Obama, Marilyn Monroe, all related directly. This is Berwick's peerage in Boston Genealogical Society. Just look up the Bush-Windsor bloodline. There is an incredible... The main mind control program that is in the world is to make you think that you can do anything with yourself. Because you can't unless you're part of this group. You won't get past a certain amount of wealth because taxes will take the top off it. You won't get through into the entertainment industry unless you do what you're told. You won't get through into the film industry unless you do what you're told. You won't make any significant inroads that are going to upset the status quo, or you'll wind up dead wearing stockings with an orange stuffed in your mouth. This is what will happen. Okay, this is exactly what happens, okay? And that is one of the main things, that once you start to realise that, you realise that what a mess we are in. And then it doesn't become so mental that the entire 60s thing was all a set-up. Yes?
So you can assure us that all these people that they wave in front of us that you read about in papers and magazines are all on a connection to the...
Yeah, well, they're definitely, like, some of them are bloodline connected, provably. Some of them are just useful morons. And the ones that basically don't outlive their usefulness, Jimi Hendrix, Pete Tosh, Bob Marley, end up murdered. And that's just as straightforward as I can say it. You don't tend to murder people anymore, they just turn them into persona non grata, like George Michael is the one that basically nobody likes anymore.
Well, Michael Jackson.
Thank you, Michael Jackson. Yeah, Michael Jackson starts talking about Sony Records, ends up dead. Sony get the rights to his records again. It's one thing that people don't seem to realise. He died within hours. We've got a new Paul McCartney best of. We've got a new John Lennon best of. Why is that? Because then all of a sudden the Apple recordings goes back to Sony. Yeah. And Tony Mottola of Sony Records went out with Mariah Carey. This is Mariah Carey that refused to go into Sony Records because she was being chased around by ghosts. Oh, yeah. She took a bath with all the clothes on. She went batshit. That's mind control. That's someone being mind controlled, basically. So this is why Britney Spears did it. This is why her boyfriend owns the rights to all her material and stuff like that, because they're controlling her, they've got a handle on her.
But we accept things. I mean, how many people have asked who do we owe money to? You know, we
Of
accept
course,
we
yeah.
accept cuts. You'll never find that information out.
No.
It must be but my own opinion on that one is the Rothschild, whatever, they want to say 7% interest on money, and they put money on the IMF, World Bank, whatever, and they pay on that.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, it always brings this thing back to you.
You never find out.
There's a thing called consensus transfer, okay, where basically people don't want to be told the truth because they've got this psychological thing, and this is the way the world is. And at the minute, it's not perfect, but at least I know what's up, what's down, what's left, what's right, okay? You start pulling away at that, okay? One thing, one strand, all of a sudden I have to examine everything. And I have to start looking at this and going, well, you know, if they lied to me about this, you know, if they lied to me about like the corruption of the police, maybe they lied to me about the corruption of the medical facilities, maybe they were lying to me about the corruption of the banking facilities, maybe they lied to me about everything. Maybe it's pointless me turning up to work. We can't have that because then we'll have the collapse of society. And people get really, really angry. People, like, this is a response that you get, and it's because you basically, it's like a bucket of cold water in the face. And people don't want to be told about it because, frankly, they're quite happy ticking along or going on to get along. It's one of these things, it's like the ostrich syndrome. You stick your head in the ground, you do this. This is childish, right, okay? Why do children do that? Because you can't see them, they're not there anymore. And that's the same principle, it's the same psychological principle you're reverting. You're going back to a childlike state because, essentially, you've been told, slightly equivalent to being told that your parents are going to kill you at some point. Right, okay, this is the point. You've put your entire trust in this entity, this society, this world, and we've just found out that it's not actually out for our best interests.
I've noticed royal family,
Yeah.
such people like Princess Anne or Richard, you start saying when you talk about the Queen, they tell us that the Queen is our mother.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, that's...
And we have to believe that
Well, quite, this is the point. But again, it's that concept, it's that parental authoritarian thing. A lot of any sort of authoritarian thing works because it's the concept of the father or somebody that knows better, or, you know, that's the thing. You're psychologically wired to listen to the bigger person because they're bigger, so they're less likely to get killed. So that's it. Yes, sorry, you're going to have to be the last one. But I'm going to pub, so if anyone wants to come to the pub with me, you know.
Today in the paper, it's saying that the CIA are going to take over our police force. So is that a good thing?
No, it's not a good thing, but the CIA taking over our police force, there's already elements that are in control of our police force. There's two things that I'm preaching convert here. One is Freemasons. You do not get up the ranks of police without being a Freemason. They are so adamant about that they put the checkerboard. Right, okay, it's not even subtle. Right, okay, this is the thing. So, Freemasonry. What is Freemasonry? It's not this mysterious thing that everyone makes it out to be. All it is a proving ground. He's all right because he's X-level degree, and you don't get to X-level degree without basically towing the line. So there is that aspect, and let's not mock about, right? Okay, the police, right? The royal family have within their powers the right to revert any law. So this concept that, oh no, you can't get killed for treason and you can't get hung for treason anymore. Yeah, you can if they decide that they want to. They have the power to override any law that they want. So, you know, CIA and royal family is sustainably set anyway, to be quite honest. So, yeah. Apparently Alfred Hubbard introduced the Pope to LSD. I don't know which Pope it was, to be quite honest. Pope on drugs. Call the Pope nice. Right, yeah. Thank you very much then.
Neil, brilliant bit of research, that fantastic presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Neil Sanders. Thank you.
The psychedelic drug LSD was first synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, and he was working for a company called Sandoz, S-A-N-D-O-S, which is now called Novartis. And this is a pharmacological laboratory in Basel, Switzerland. And he first discovered LSD in 1938, but it wasn't until 5 years later, in April 1943, that he actually discovered that it had psychedelic properties. Now, the reason that he was looking into LSD was to obtain a respiratory and a circulatory stimulant, which is known as an analeptic. It basically used to be used in surgery. But whilst he was resynthesizing this in 1943, he accidentally absorbed a bit of it into his fingers. Some of you may know that LSD, you can absorb it through your skin. And so serendipitously, he managed to discover the fabulous psychedelic properties of it. And he described the events. He said, "I was affected by a remarkable restlessness, combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant, intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I found the daylight to be unpleasantly glaring. I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes, and intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away." And so this was with an absolutely microscopic dose of LSD that he managed to do this. So 3 days later, on 19th of April 1943, Hofmann decided to perform what would be termed an ill-advised experiment on himself in order to determine the true effects of LSD. See, Hofmann ingested 0.25 milligrams or 250 micrograms of pure, uncut LSD, an amount which he predicted was a threshold dose. Now, some of you probably know that a threshold dose of LSD is actually just under 20 micrograms, so what he'd actually taken there constituted more than 10 strong hits. Now, less than an hour after administering this, shall we say, Herculean dose, Hofmann experienced sudden and intense changes in his perceptions. Now, he didn't think that this was a very good idea to stay at work, so he decided to go home. Luckily, he was persuaded not to use his car because it was illegal in the time, because it was during wartime. So far more sensibly, he decided to make a trip home on his bicycle, which I think we can assume was probably at least difficult. Now, those who participate in recreational LSD have since named this fateful day, the 19th of April 1943, as Bicycle Day. And so if somebody says that they're enjoying Bicycle Day, basically what it means is that they're going down and take some LSD. And it is commemorated with stamps in Switzerland as well. So, on this psychedelic journey, basically his condition began to deteriorate incredibly rapidly. His mind raced with very powerful feelings of anxiety, and he actually began to believe that his next door neighbour, who he'd never really got on with, he thought that the explanation for this was that she's a witch and she's cursed him, and that he was going to die because of it. Later, when he sort of started to calm down, he realised that it was the LSD, but then just thought, oh, I've poisoned myself, this is no good, is it? And so eventually a doctor was called and basically tried to attend to the wildly tripping Hofmann. And he seemed fine. The only thing that actually seemed physically wrong with him were his eyes were the size of saucers. But apart LSD, principally, and how LSD links in with the 60s movement. Hopefully all of you have got sort of like a cursory knowledge of what I mean by, say, flower power generation, the anti-war movement, the hippies, and the 60s music scene. My contention is that, sadly, the whole thing, the elements that started the 60s, that sort of fermented the 60s, and then the elements that ultimately destroyed the 60s were all intelligence agency experiments. This is my contention, and hopefully I'm going to show that with this talk. So, one of the main ways of sort of creating mind control is through trauma. I don't know if anyone's ever been in like a car accident or anything like that, or knows anybody who's been in a car accident. Often you won't be able to remember the actual crash itself. You'll sort of wake up at the side of the road, or you'll have to be told later what happened. So, oh no, yeah, you span across the road and you ended up flipping the car 3 or 4 times. That's not because you've blanked out. It's not because you've become unconscious or anything like that. What it is that your brain has a defense mechanism whereby very, very traumatic memories, it will blank them out. It will create an amnesic shell around them, therefore basically stopping you from reliving that traumatic experience again and again and again and again. And this is why basically when repressed memories come back, that's why it happens, because these amnesic barriers are breaking down. If you can do that enough, what you can do is you can split the mind into several sort of barriers like this, like a sort of honeycomb or a grid pattern. And each of the individual sort of, sections could be considered like an individual personality, and they could even be unaware of the other personalities. So that is one method. But what we're going to talk about today is the druggings, essentially. Now, although the application of trauma is effective, it was very, very effectively used by the CIA and also by Nazi Germany as well. What they wanted to do was they wanted to gain a far more measured control in response to stimuli, and so the CIA were far more interested in the use of drugs and also the use of hypnotic suggestion. But drugs such as LSD were seen as a potential weapon due to their hallucinatory and perception-altering effects. Now, in 1951, in the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, it is alleged that the CIA released a cloud of high-grade aerosolized LSD into the area, which basically caused mass hallucinations. Several people went mad, and a couple of people actually ended up dying. One person drowned under the effects of the drug. Now, actually, if you go into the official records, the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident is still explained as being the result of the fabulously psychedelic qualities of some mouldy local bread. But to be quite honest, if we're being brutally honest, the fact that the allegation that the CIA basically attacked a nation state with an experimental drug has always floated ominously on the horizon. An undated CIA document entitled D-lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25, stated, "Some of the more outstanding effects are the mental confusion, helplessness, and extreme anxiety which are produced by minute doses of this substance. Based upon these reactions, its potential use in offensive psychological warfare and in interrogation is considerable. It may become one of the most important psychochemical agents." So where did LSD come from? Well, say, okay, fine, we can't produce the real thing, but what we can do is we can synthetically copy it, and we can synthetically start to produce LSD for you. In 1954, the CIA began Operation MK Pilot. Now, MK Pilot was taking place at Lexington Narcotics Hospital. This is essentially like the Priory or something like that, so people are there to get treated for drug addiction. And instead, specifically black heroin addicts were tested with LSD, not for any particular curative reason, just to see how much LSD one particular person could take. Now, the same year, who would later spearhead Tavistock, the Tavistock Institute's LSD experiments in the Haight-Ashbury area, had his book, The Doors of Perception, published. Now, the Doors rock group actually took their name from the title of that specific text. And we'll come back to Aldous Huxley later. Now, in mid-1954, the pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly finally synthesized LSD at the CIA's behest, and this basically gave the CIA a limitless and relatively inexpensive supply, and it removed the necessity for Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, to provide their stockpiles. A year later, in 1955, Aldous Huxley actually experienced his first LSD trip, and then shortly after, he published his essay Heaven and Hell. Now, Heaven and Hell discusses the relationship between bright, colourful objects, geometric designs, psychoactive substances, art, and profound experiences, and it's a promotional tool for the use of LSD. Heaven and Hell refer metaphorically to what Huxley perceives as the two contrary mystical experiences that could potentially wade you through the doors of perception. Essentially, you're going to have a good time, or you're going to have a bad time. Now, in 1961, the army actually initiated the use of LSD in interrogations on foreign agents, and this was called Operation Third Chance. Another operation that also used LSD in interrogation scenarios was called Operation Derby Hat. However, by 1962, officially the CIA withdrew support for above-ground LSD research studies, but this is absolute garbage because basically the Tulane University was carrying on with Robert Heath. Harvard was doing experimentation, McGill University in Canada, Colgate University was doing it, St Thomas's Hospital in London was doing it, Lexington, Kentucky, and about 40 others basically. So the idea that they stopped actually using LSD is something of a misnomer. And at the same time, Congress passed and began to enforce drug safety regulations. So what they did was they made the substance illegal. Now, in the same year, the FDA designated LSD as an experimental-only drug and strictly restricted research. And by April 1966, Sanders had officially stopped supplying LSD to research scientists. This is not because they care about you and because they don't want you to harm yourself on LSD. This is so that only the CIA can study it. That's it. That's as simple as that. There is always another reason behind any drug legislation. In this particular thing, it was so that nobody else could get to understand how this particular drug worked. And as I say, Ewan Cameron was still using LSD throughout the 60s in Canada, as was William Sargent in London. And LSD experiments were also performed in Birmingham Hospital in England under a gentleman called Joel Elks, who later went over to America and continued with MK Ultra. And
Can you take seats, please? Park up. Right, welcome to New Horizons, everybody, and a massively happy New Year to you all. And a huge welcome back to Neil Sanders with MK Ultra, LSD and the Hippie Movement. Neil's interest and expertise in the research and exposure of mass social conditioning, highlighting the brilliant minds and cold hearts of certain types of, usually men. Social conditioning has been around for centuries, varying from overt and aggressive to gradually more subtle. The Inquisition, for example, or the coercion of men and underage boys to fight during World War I, for instance. The boys being presented with a white feather by girls, themselves altered in some way. The men exposed to persistent newspaper headlines and propagandist posters. My grandfather was an infantry soldier at 15 after no doubt feeling the call of duty. Neil tonight focuses on the marked increase in certain drug availability and sudden appearance of a group of young people worlds apart from their parents during the mid-60s and onwards, the hippies, who may have evolved naturally or, on the other hand, been the result of a well-planned experiment. So, without further ado, let's find out a little bit more. Neil Sanders, thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Excellent, that's the spirit. Right, okay, so hopefully some of you know who I am. I tend to talk about mind control. Mind control falls broadly into four categories. Trying to coerce information, truth serums, getting information from interrogation scenarios, wiping people's memories so that they cannot reveal facts and such in interrogations. The total control of emotions and physicality, which can be done through hypnosis, it can be done through trauma, it can be done through the use of certain machines, radio waves and electromagnetic functions. And then the final type falls into the category of propaganda and some social control, perception management, directing the social trends and such like that. So today what I'm going to talk about is, apart from that, he was physically okay. So the doctor basically sat and chatted to him I think he basically took him about an hour of just calming, talking to him, soothing and chatting to him. And eventually his anxiety was replaced by what he described as an exquisite euphoria. And again, Hoffman described this. He said, "Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colours and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegating, opening, and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in coloured fountains, rearranging and hybridising themselves in a constant flux. Now this is LSD that was produced by Sanders. This is obviously years later in 1951. But in 1947, and you've got to remember that this is when the CIA was first starting, this is when the CIA was taking its fledgling steps and moving from the SS to the LSS to the CIA. And so it was incredibly interested in LSD because obviously it could be a game-changing drug. At the same time, the US Office of Naval Intelligence was beginning mescaline studies. Mescaline is basically kind of like LSD. It's not quite as potent. It's more soft because it comes from peyote, which is a mushroom, so it's not as very intense as LSD is. And they were using this for interrogation purposes under the sponsorship of Project Chatter. Now, the same year, 1947, LSD first appeared in Swiss pharmacological journals. But it wasn't until 2 years later in 1949 that a gentleman called Dr. Max Rinkel actually brought LSD back to the United States from Sanders and began experimenting with patients in hospitals in Boston. Soon after this, also in 1949, a gentleman called Nick Bursell started experimenting covertly on patients in hospitals in Los Angeles as well. In 1953, which some of you may know is when MKUltra was starting, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was part and was financed by MKUltra, began treating alcoholics with LSD. Whether he was actually treating them or whether this is a cover for examining the effects, we will probably never know, but I lean towards the latter, if I was being honest. Now, the same year, in 1953, the CIA, who was clearly taken with this new science, attempted to buy 10 kilograms of LSD from Sanders laboratories. Now, bearing in mind that a single gram of LSD contains around 10,000 doses, so with such a large order, we can assume that the CIA was trying to corner the market in this particular substance. Unfortunately, Sanders informed the CIA that at that time, only 40 grams of LSD had ever been made in the entire world, and so unfortunately, 10 kilograms was a little bit out of their hands. And this is basically because making LSD is incredibly difficult. You need to get the precise conditions on ergot mold in order to cause the lysergic acid, and then you have to do several other things to do it to make it turn into LSD. So the likelihood that these French people went mad from eating mouldy bread it's just rubbish, isn't it? So what happened? So the CIA basically didn't want all this LSD, so they decided that the best thing to do was go to the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. Now Eli Lilly